Masterpiece. By definition, a product of outstanding artistry, skill, or workmanship. This term is reserved for those rare instances where something is able to go above and beyond the qualities and expectations within their respective fields.
If you do a quick YouTube search for Xenoblade Chronicles, you'll find no shortage of people calling the game a masterpiece. Starting today, you might even see my video popping up saying the same thing.
Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is a masterpiece!
I genuinely believe it to be a masterpiece.
Xenoblade Chronicles is a masterpiece.
Is Xenoblade Definitive Edition a masterpiece?
That I think masterpiece is an appropriate repute.
The best video game I've ever played.
This is probably one of the greatest games ever made.
It has one of the most fantastic stories in any video game, period.
One of the best RPGs ever created.
Best JRPG of this generation by far.
I would call this game peak fiction.
A beacon of light for the medium of video games.
Why exactly is Xenoblade Chronicles a masterpiece? I mean, it's a fantastic game, without a doubt, but there are other games that I feel are just as good, if not better. Plus, most games that earn the reputation of masterpiece tend to be innovators of or set the standard for their respective genres, and from my perspective, Xenoblade Chronicles didn't do that, yet somehow it's still considered one of the greatest games of our time. So that begs the question, what makes Xenoblade Chronicles a masterpiece?
What makes Xenoblade Chronicles a masterpiece? That's easy. It isn't one. It's nowhere close. No word describes Xenoblade Chronicles better than disappointment. Clunky, expository and repetitive dialogue causes the characters to appear shallow and uninteresting. That in turn emphasizes the broken and unimmersive world, which leads to a lack of investment in the story, which leads to this inconsistent mess of a game. It has a brilliant hook in its high concept, but execution so poor that only the shocking twist can maintain any level of engagement. The game is not bad throughout, but every tiny fragment of greatness is just a diamond needle in a haystack of shit. It bleeds into every aspect of the game. The laws of this universe are constant between cutscene and gameplay, until they aren't, which causes the disconnect to damage the story. The world is brilliant and beautiful, but overwhelmingly empty and lacking in both intrinsic and extrinsic rewards for exploration. The townsfolk and their quests build an amazing network of characters that are all connected to one another, yet too many quests are uninteresting filler that conditions the player to ignore it all, and too few quests are at all anchored to the world they inhabit. The major characters are all incredibly compelling on a conceptual level, but they forget their motivations, their interests and their skills to just serve as mouthpieces for banter with no further purpose, and every obvious payoff that could make their characterization so much stronger is completely missed. The soundtrack is absolutely brilliant, with nearly every single track being a great listen, even on repeat for hours on end. Yet the character themes are used as generic tracks for their tone, and too many tracks go criminally underutilized. The overall lack of coherence means there's little deeper meaning you can draw from the tracks, their motifs or their instruments. I went into this video thinking the game was decent, but far from the masterpiece that everyone says. I wanted to point out the many problems that kept the game from greatness. Yet with every flaw I looked into, I saw a glimmer of potential that I had previously overlooked. Within every point of praise, I found mountains of issues that kept it from greatness. And with all the many stretches of bland and uninteresting filler in between the points I thought good or bad, I realized just how much of the writing was repetitive or pointless. How many scenes passed with nothing being accomplished, or at least so little that it could be rewritten to a quarter the length and would feel more natural for it. There are small parts I never thought I'd praise, which I've gotten a newfound appreciation for, but overall I've come to hate this game. Not because the game is bad, but because as I stare into this abyss I see something buried deep down that could be saved. Something deep inside that I would truly love. But that's not what this game is. This game is a disappointment. It won't be apparent immediately, but the deeper I get into this game, the more the cracks become unavoidable. But before I start spiraling, I should mention my approach with the game, as there's no end to the number of ways one could play it. I've had multiple playthroughs of this game in the past, which have been far more natural than what I'm doing here, but I ultimately feel like the best way to cover the game in its entirety is to be needlessly thorough. To that end, I've made sure to complete the entire game, side quest, achievement, art books and all. Not just that, but I made sure to complete every branch of the mutually exclusive story quests too. To show just how much this ruins the pacing of the story, I will be doing all of it more or less the moment it becomes available, as that's when the developers presumably intended for it to be done. In the interest of coherency, I will avoid referencing ahead with my coverage of the story, instead using only what the game has already provided to make my points. Because of that, while I will be covering the entirety of the game, there will be no out-of-place spoilers, and it should be easy to follow along even for someone who hasn't played the game. There will, however, be conclusions made based on evidence and foreshadowing presented, which will not be confirmed until much later, which may be considered spoilers by some. That said, while I'm not sure I could honestly recommend the game without a few caveats at least, I will say that the best way to experience it is to go in completely blind, because the many twists in the story are far more engaging than anything else going on. In this rare case, I actually feel like spoilers would ruin the experience, something I don't believe is true for greater works of fiction. I'll be covering the game's mechanics, content, writing and music as it becomes relevant, and in order to temper my arguments, I've gone out of my way to watch practically every single video covering the game. My goal was to seek out arguments praising aspects of the game to make sure there wasn't something I overlooked, and while I did work in some of their reflections into my script, I will largely avoid using their clips. Mostly to prevent my videos from bloating even further and becoming a response to every video essay and analysis by the community. If there's a valid and unique point I see someone make, I'll make sure they are credited. So with all that out of the way and without further ado... The opening of Xenoblade Chronicles is superb with how it sets up the world and the basic framework through which we view it. Arguably, this starts as far back as the main menu. Somber music accompanies this view of a great wide field where attention is drawn to this red sword-like weapon stuck in the ground. The motif of a sword stuck in the ground brings forth imagery of battlefields, though none is to be seen here. Combine that with the somber music and one might feel the relief of a battle having ended, mixed with the sadness of the losses on both sides. The only other detail that catches our eye is the mechanical rubble in the distance, which could hint either at the battles to come or the technology of the world. We don't yet have context for this broken down machinery, so it raises as many questions as this incredibly out of place weapon in the center. Something that's notably missing from this scene, however, is the massive robot seen towering over this very same scene in the box art of the game. The reason why is unclear, but its absence is definitely noticeable. Eventually, the music swells into something far more epic as a full orchestra joins in. Feeling either like a call to action or as a prideful testament to all that has happened. It then mellows out into the simple, quiet melody we began with, starting and ending with the same bittersweet tone. As the game starts, we are treated to a creation myth about the world. It's concise enough that I can let it speak for itself.
Long ago, the world was nothing more than an endless sea, cloaked in a boundless sky, reaching as far as could possibly be imagined. Then two great titans came into existence. The Bionis and the Mechonis. The Titans were locked in a timeless battle. Until at last, only their lifeless corpses remained. Eons have passed. Now, our world, this vast land stretching across the remains of the Bionis, is under attack from a relentless force known as the Mechon.
The dichotomy is clearly established. A titan of biological life where mankind lives, posed against the cold and mechanical titan whose robotic inhabitants pose a threat to humanity. Thus, the fight between the two titans in ages past is continued by their children today. The central conflict that the story and the world itself revolves around is thus the very first thing the game establishes. From the perspective of mankind, to rid the world of Mechon would be the same as saving the world. The main menu screen depicting a world without the Mechonis and the sword stuck into the ground near the remnants of destroyed Mechon suddenly makes a lot of sense. We can imagine how even such a great victory might come at a great enough cost to warrant the somber music. Something interesting to note is that this voiceover does not appear to be diegetic. It's told by the disembodied voice of a character we've yet to meet, and it fades out as focus shifts to the battle at hand. If the voice is just a meta narration for the player, I can't know if the character actually knows or believes this story. At the same time, if the narrator is a character, I have to question the accuracy of every statement and how he would know that it's true. I like unreliable narrators, but it would be nice to have some clarity about whether this is a recounting of events from an omniscient observer, or just some creation myth the characters believe. I suppose we'll have to puzzle that together as we go. After the narration, we see soldiers overwhelmed and forced to retreat from the swarming hordes of Mechon. We see how several soldiers have to struggle to take out a single machine, and how easily they are defeated in turn. The cutscene takes great care to show off the Mechon's heartless nature as the machines slaughter human soldiers without a sign of anything we could register as emotion. While the humans bark orders, beg for their lives and attempt to warn their kin, the Mechon are eerily silent. We see this shot of soldiers fleeing, and then there's one man running in the opposite direction, towards the fight. We catch glimpses of this hero wielding what appears to be the weapon stuck into the ground in the main menu, though it has opened up to unleash a blade of bright blue light. He uses this blade of light to cut down the Mechon with ease. This hero shows his bravery and skill immediately, but our attention is directed towards his weapon, which seemingly ignores the metal plating of these foes. Most other soldiers are equipped with guns firing blasts of energy at the Mechon, and the only times we've seen a Mechon attacked with melee weapons, it's been several soldiers against a single toppled Mechon, and they still struggle to injure it. Our hero gets his first spoken lines.
They're advancing down our weak right flank. For a bunch of soulless machines, they seem to know a thing or two. But we'll see.
Talking seemingly to himself as we immediately cut to show him being all alone out here. This blunt bit of exposition ends up telling us very little about our hero other than that he likes to talk to himself. If I were to scrape it off all the meaning I can, then he also has some tactical thinking, considering he's commenting on the Mechon attacking where they are weak. Oh, and he also seems pretty cocky, though that's justifiable considering how easily he's taken out a mountain of Mechon on his own. So while it has little meaning for the character, it does tell us a lot about the Mechon. They are able to exploit a weakness in the humans' formations, implying they either have a degree of intelligence or that they are guided by something intelligent. We cut away from our hero right as he activates a power of his mysterious blade, preparing himself to face down another couple dozen Mechon. When reinforcements finally arrive, he's taking cover, or possibly just catching a break behind a Mechon corpse, clearly unharmed. He and his weapon are absurdly powerful, considering how strong the Mechon appear to be against the other soldiers. The two out-of-uniform members of his reinforcements appear to be wielding unique melee weapons, a gunblade and a pair of claws, so these are absolutely worth paying attention to, unlike the common fodder that surrounds them. Hulk Hogan calls out our hero's name, Dumban, and tells him they've been ordered to retreat back to Colony 6. Duncan disagrees, much to the dismay of his suspiciously evil-looking friend. He then makes a quick speech about risking their lives to change their destinies, and we get the feeling he's incredibly cocky and reckless. But hey, he does confirm that it's his weapon that grants him the power to take down all the Mechon, the Monado. Huh. Curious name. Dixon is worried for Dumban since apparently the Monado takes a great toll on Dumban's body, but Dumban reassures him that he's still in control. Which implies he could lose control, right? Perhaps it takes such a toll on Dumban because he's resisting its influence. I don't know if he was this cocky before the Monado, so that's not exactly evidence. I'll just have to remember the line and see how it plays out. If it's brought up this early, it will surely be an important thing to remember for later. Dumban convinces the others to join him in the assault, despite Evilman's protests, and Dixon says something about giving them a Hom's welcome. What the hell is a Hom? Dumban and Dixon charge on ahead, and the Evilman monologues about being evil and betraying his friends, complete with sinister laugh and all. Please, Dumban, pick friends who look less evil in the future. I'm also not sure it was really necessary to have this guy tell us outright that he's evil and planning to betray his two named companions. If they had even just cut the line after "I'm not throwing my life away," it would be enough for us to get that he's planning something, and I'd say even that would be unnecessary since it's already clear that he's not happy about risking his life to fight. But fine, I guess everyone in this universe just monologues exposition to themselves when only the camera is around. Oh, except for maybe that one guy who should be right next to him and that we haven't seen run away in the background of any of these shots. It would be silly for this guy to do his evil monologue while within earshot of others, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. It's possible for this other soldier guy to have left while off screen, even though we should have seen him do so. We do see some people retreating in a few shots, showing that it's something the soldier could actually do. So maybe the soldier already retreated and Momcar truly is alone monologuing about how he would rather just retreat than follow Dunban into battle. So why does he follow Dunban into battle, when he could just run away like all the other soldiers? Why go out of your way to betray Dunban when you could just leave right now? Dunban is already acting decoy for you. So the scene establishes that Dunban is reckless, that the Monado is dangerous, that Dixon disapproves of Dunban's recklessness, and that the nameless evil-looking guy is not only evil but also completely idiotic. Combine that with Dunban's opening line and we're already dealing with messy writing. But who cares? Time for some gameplay. The combat right now is very basic and the tutorial tells us to take it one step at a time. Target an enemy, draw your weapon, stand close to your target to start auto-attacking, and then use your arts. Dunban has 2 arts that recharge after 4 hits and they share a cooldown. Monado Enchant is a buff used to make your party members able to damage Mechon, and Monado Buster is simply a strong attack. The tutorial is kinda vague about Enchant, but fortunately there are tooltips when you select the art. The decision making in combat is pretty simple so far, but that's to be expected for a tutorial fight. What I'm not a huge fan of here is the art icons. It's cool how they resemble the symbols which light up on the Monado both in cutscenes and gameplay, but I can't read them. So to me they're just hard to tell apart and I'm forced to rely on their position on the hotbar to tell me which is which without checking the tooltip. Well, that's not an issue yet, I'm seeing 6 empty slots here, so it's pretty clear where this is going. While it wasn't quite as easy as Dunban made it seem in the cutscenes, we still swatted the Mechon like flies. Since the only reason the other 2 can damage the Mechon at all is because of the Monado, we now know why they bring melee weapons when practically everyone else uses guns. Afterwards, we see the crew ready themselves for battle against even more Mechon. We can tell that Dunban's right arm seems to be affected by the Monado. Before they charge, we learn the evil man's name is Momcar. At least we see that Dixon seems cool, as he throws himself in harm's way to protect Dunban and the Monado. Though I suppose cutscenes in this game operate by rule of cool, considering Dixon isn't even slightly impacted by having one of his lungs completely obliterated alongside his shoulder blade and ribcage. At the least they set our expectations early that grievous and fatal injuries aren't a big deal, but then again, now I have to wonder what this attack could possibly have done to Dunban, since it's so harmless. Dunban seems to suffer more and more from the Monado and need Dixon's help to even stand. Momcar runs away shouting at them that he's taking the chance to escape since the Mechon are only after the Monado, which is an interesting statement. So the Monado is the cause of this conflict, but also the only thing they can use to fight back, is that right? That means it's of utmost importance that the Mechon don't get their hands on it. Though I'm curious to find out what they want with it. Unfortunately, Momcar then monologues during his run that he's planning to come back for the Monado later, which would probably only happen if Dunban died, likely by the hands of the Mechon, who would then take the Monado. So that's another brilliant example of Momcar's lack of brilliance. In fact, he's so caught up in his monologuing that he trips and falls over absolutely nothing, followed by the realization that he's running straight into the enemies like an idiot. Seems like both Dixon and Dunban tried to warn him that he was running the wrong way before, but he was too evil and dumb to listen. What a death. That's odd though. He still hasn't really done anything, so killing him off this early is very suspicious. It's possible that we will get plenty of flashbacks showing his history with Dunban and Dixon, thus justifying his existence and the creation of his unique assets. Or maybe his betrayal and death heavily influences Dunban and Dixon's characters to the point where this was necessary, even if his story presence ends here. Or maybe, since we never saw the body, he just survived, somehow. Dunban takes a last stand against a huge Mechon, not discouraged in the slightest since he has the power of God and enemy on his side.
Vile Mechon, if you think the Homs, the people of Bionis, are just waiting here for you to pick us off, you are sorely mistaken!
We zoom out to show that this fight is taking place on the Mechonis sword. We then pan over several other locations all over the Bionis body, giving us an idea of how big the world is. Judging by the pose of the Bionis, I'm really curious where Colony 6 is located. Surely it must be on the frozen right arm or somewhere near where the blade intersects the Bionis torso, right? How else would they retreat there? I'm sure we'll find out before long. As the camera flies around, there's a strong glow from the sword, possibly Dunban's final Monado art. And with that, our title screen drop. Wait, did Dunban just refer to the people of the Bionis as Homs? So that's what that meant. Why not just call them humans? It's not even a localization change, I checked. Monolith really just wanted to change the name of humans. That's pretty unusual even for a fantasy setting. 1 year after the battle on the sword, we see a bunch of rusted scrap, some of it from dead Mechon. An unseen voice is excited about his finds, looking over what parts he can salvage from the broken Mechon and use for various purposes. It's the same voice that gave us the narration in the beginning. He discards all of the scrap as useless and seemingly gives up and falls backwards into the grass, landing on his sword. Ouch. As he lies there, not bleeding out, he gets distracted by a dragonfly. They are short-lived insects which symbolize transformation and to a lesser degree rebirth, but I'm sure that's nothing significant. He then gets further distracted by another broken Mechon he didn't see before. He tries to pry the armor off, but the Mechon seemingly comes to life. Out of nowhere, someone runs in with a shield, shouting "Shulk," bashing the undead Mechon. This large lad is named Rhine and wields the strange shield lance that we saw on a few soldiers in the last battle. Neat. Unfortunately, the creature he bashed wasn't a Mechon, but something much worse. It's the dreaded tutorial crab. The last words of the cutscene is Rhine shouting an actual tutorial to Shulk. Rhine will take aggro and topple the crab, so Shulk can use his arts to kill it while it's down. Cool, so I guess arts are actual combat moves in-universe then. The few mechanics there are to arts so far don't make much sense in-universe, but I guess I'll give it some points for trying to integrate story and gameplay. In this fight, we learned that death is a possibility and that we can kill enemies. Okay. We also learn how to select and use arts. Okay. Kinda already did that. Shulk has 2 arts. Backslash for damage and light heal to prevent death. Easy enough so far. Easier than Dunban even. We also learned that the first tutorial with Dunban was misleading, because most arts don't recharge on auto-attack, but over time instead. The central art on your hotbar is called a talent art, which like Dunban's Monado arts recharge with auto-attacks. Sadly, the fight ends too fast for us to learn anything else, so you can't even see this elusive break effect on the talent art. Nor will you find out what Ryan meant when he said he'd toppled the crab. So, there is more to this, but the first fight doesn't tell you with tutorials. It's followed by a fight with a caterpillar, where the pop-ups teach you about keeping aggro on Rhine, so that Shulk can get the bonus damage from backslash by positioning himself behind the enemy. This fight might be even easier somehow, especially for players who didn't know about the positionals on Shulk's arts against the crab. Alright, so what's going on here that we haven't been told? Well, Shulk's talent art can break an enemy. Rhine has an art to topple a broken enemy. A toppled enemy can't fight back for a while, you can't miss him with attacks, and you'll have stronger crits against them. This means that the best time to backslash is when an enemy is toppled, just to make sure it doesn't miss and that you get the bonus damage on a crit. So, there are more mechanics here than we are told, even with such a small amount of options available to us. The game will teach us toppling later, and the health of these enemies really makes it seem we're not meant to even accidentally topple them yet. Instead, I guess they simply want us to experiment with these few options. Though it is sad to see such a brilliant setup with Ryan telling us in a voiced cutscene how our battle plan should be to topple the enemy, only to give us 2 enemies in a row we are unlikely to be able to do that with. Such a waste. After that brief gameplay intermission, the cutscenes continue. Ryan chastises Shulk for wandering off on his own, in this dead end on a long road. Not sure where else he could have gone. Ryan then informs that it's in fact dangerous outside the colony, information that I'm sure Shulk is fully aware of considering he brought a sword, and may even have brought Ryan for further protection, it's unclear. At least we get some character traits out of this conversation. Ryan is worried for Shulk's well-being, while Shulk only cares that he got the scrap and how happy everyone in the colony will be. No clue why everyone in the colony will be really happy, because Shulk managed to get his hands on a square meter of Mechon armor plating that he planned to just turn into a shield, but whatever. I suppose Shulk says this to tell the player he is the overly helpful sort that would gladly do side quests for hours on end, while Ryan is the kind of guy who would tag along in a party just to make sure Shulk is safe. Not a bad dynamic for the starting characters in a JRPG party, and I'm sure their relationship will be fleshed out beyond just being friends. This dialogue is clunking harder than the prologue though. Apparently, Shulk is also an inventor who learned to make weapons from Dixon, the mustache hom from the cutscene 1 year ago. Nice to know he made it out alive. Can't wait to see what cool weapons Shulk is going to make throughout the game, or the many other possible ways him being an inventor could play a part in the story to come. Will we see him reverse engineer the Mechon to get a better understanding of them? Perhaps he'll devise machinery to help him overcome some major obstacles. Maybe his perspective as an inventor drastically shapes his perception of the world, allowing him to find creative uses for what others deem to be garbage. Maybe his entire philosophy is analogous for machinery, like appreciating how members of society operate like cogs in a machine and being upset when such harmony is disrupted. Maybe there will even be some crafting mechanics that takes advantage of Shulk's established trait as an inventor. There's so much the developers can do with this, I can't wait! We also learned that Dumban is still around and that the Monado didn't fall into Mechon class. Shulk aspires to learn the Monado's secrets one day, which makes sense. After all, it's apparently a Mechon magnet that wars are fought over, which single-handedly can make any weapon able to pierce through Mechon armor. Learning how to use it safely, or to replicate it, would be a huge boon to humankind. Rein shows himself as being very supportive, but urges them to hurry back so the Defense Force Colonel doesn't kill him for being late for drills. So I guess Rein is part of the military, just favoring the Defense Force's melee weapons over guns. I like the idea of Xenoblade Chronicles, except Rein has a gun. Sadly, we don't live in that reality. But even though the scene ends, I don't want to move on just yet. All the dialogue in this cutscene is incredibly clunky and expository, with both characters stating things they have no reason to say, exclusively so the players can be spoon-fed information. This dialogue is shit.
Thanks, Rein. That was a close one. Man, what were you doing wandering off by yourself? Stay where I can keep an eye on you. It's pretty dangerous outside of the colony. There are all kinds of monsters.
Shulk absolutely already knows there are monsters out there. No need to say it.
Yeah, but thanks to you, we got its shell. Everyone in the colony is going to be really happy. I'm more worried about you than the shell. Oh, whatever. Knowing what you're like, at least you'll make a decent weapon out of it. This scrap driver's excellent. I just learned by watching Dixon make weapons.
Why would Shulk's response to Rein complimenting his weapon craft be to tell him how he learned it? Rein would already know that. Imagine telling your artist friend their drawing is really good and getting the answer back, I just picked up a few things from going to art school and spending years practicing during my free time. Humans don't talk like that, but apparently Homs do.
Of course, Dunban's weapon still beats them all. The Monado. I hope I can figure out the secret of his power one day.
Rein awkwardly segues the conversation into mentioning the Monado, and unless Shulk goes all contemplative every time he's reminded of its existence, which would get very annoying very fast, there's no way this reaction is reasonable.
You will, Shulk. Anyway, you better get back to the colony. If I'm late for drills again, old Squaretash is gonna kill me. Squaretash? Oh, the Defense Force Colonel. He's pretty scary. Tell me about it.
Rein has a good line about Squaretash killing him if he's late for drills again, but it's immediately ruined by Shulk reacting like he's never heard that nickname before and having no clue who Rein means. Even when he finally gets it, he insists on using the full title of the Defense Force Colonel, even though the title alone would be enough to infer military status. He's also repeating that the Defense Force Colonel is scary, as if we didn't get that from the Greek god Rein being scared of him.
Sorry, I didn't mean for you to come all the way out here during your break. Don't worry about it. Let's get back.
Finally, Shulk apologizes for Rein coming out here during his break, as if it wasn't something they agreed upon beforehand. I highly doubt it's a coincidence that Rein had his break and decided to come specifically here on his own just in time for Shulk to be attacked. I acknowledge that this type of dialogue isn't a problem to many. If it eventually gets the necessary information across, who cares that it took twice the time it needed, carried no emotion, and didn't have any additional layers? Ultimately, all the information we need is explicitly stated in no uncertain terms and is hammered home a bit extra by some repetitions. It's not like any event would play out differently if the dialogue was less clunky and expository. So while I'm pointing it out as a flaw in the writing here, it will bother some a lot and others very little. That said, I don't think there's a single person alive that would consider it a downgrade if the writers could get this information across while also making it sound natural. But there's more to it than even that. If this was better written and more information could be condensed down into fewer words that has enough layers to convey even more when you dig deeper, think how much more we could learn about the characters and the world in a cutscene with the same length and word count. I'm not a particularly skilled writer, but even I could cut down this 170 word exchange by around 35 words without losing any of its meaning. That's about 1/5 of the cutscene, which could now be used to flesh out our characters further. That will always be a good thing. Right. The boys walk down this brief linear path toward... No, actually, let's talk about how the cutscenes are set up first. You may have noticed a difference between the cutscene before and after the tutorial fights. These are the two types of cutscene we'll experience in the game, and it's quite important for me to establish them early alongside their strengths and weaknesses. Partly for this video, but even more so to set up the next two games to change their approach. Most conversations here use automated animations. This means that instead of manually animating the entire cutscene, the developers created a handful of reactions and motions for the characters to use ahead of time and simply match them to the dialogue. There are a few tricks they have to work with, and they do their best to make the scenes dynamic. Characters can turn to look at any point in space, they can change facial expression, characters can move their body like Ryan's default hand motions when speaking, there's lip syncing that seems to be matched to the audio coming from the characters during their voice lines, and finally the camera can focus on things. The uses for these kinds of cutscenes are obviously limited, and it's hard to make something very dynamic with them. Watching Shulk and Ryan just stand perfectly still while talking, and at most doing a few gestures or expressions, is nowhere near as engaging as, for example, Dunban leaning in close to Mumkar to tell him that they're all going to go risk their lives to stop the Mechon. These cutscenes are far cheaper to make, reuse the same pool of animations, and can thus easily be churned out for the massive amount of dialogue in this game, as long as the scene doesn't include actions that would demand the cutscenes being tweaked by hand. While efficient, these cutscenes are lacking in visual engagement, and the developers can't match the music with the actions where the duration of each line may differ per language, and be cut short by a player skipping to the next line. So while I don't mind this type of animation, the lack of engagement from the music and visuals mean you really need the writing and voice acting to carry these scenes. And that's despite the voice acting being at a disadvantage due to short breaks between lines. Needless to say, these cutscenes make up a majority of the game cutscene time, yet very few of them stand out as exceptionally good. Then there's the other type of cutscenes that are the very opposite. Practically every action is carefully animated. Not just dynamic camera angles, but animations tailored to the character's current position, environment, and physical relation to other characters. Since all the camera movements and animations are set in stone, the devs can control the pacing at will, and even have multiple characters believably speaking at once or interrupting each other. Because they have such strict control of every part of these cutscenes, they can even match the soundtrack to the events. But this comes at a huge risk where the dub is concerned. The lip syncing is already animated and can't be changed, meaning the English voice actors have to match the lip motions. Sometimes it works great and you don't even notice, while other times you have awkward lines like this one from earlier.
The enemy's second wave! It's approaching!
On top of just matching the lip syncing, the writers are forced to translate dialogues so the same characters speak for roughly the same amount of time and in the same order. Sometimes the Japanese line may convey an amount of information difficult to fit in the same length English sentence, and sometimes the opposite is true, meaning you need to extend the sentence. This is one of those things that can make translation actually really difficult, and a good reason for the saying that there are no perfectly correct translations. Of course, that fact does not excuse the creative liberties taken at times, but at least this game appears to be the least tampered with in the series. From what I can tell, it's mostly faithful to the original, which means all my writing criticism is directed squarely at Monolith. I apologize if I miss any clear cases of damage done by localizers. I try to catch them red-handed wherever I can. Anyway, this all means that we have one style of cutscene that will at times create pretty bad line deliveries, and that also creates very strict requirements for the writers to work around. And then we have the other style of cutscene that is cheap and easy to mass produce, but that hardly produces very engaging results beyond what the writing itself can carry. And that's why it's even more tragic that the dialogue here is as clunky and thin as it is. But perhaps the clunky dialogue is largely caused by the cheap nature of those cutscenes. Restriction breeds creativity after all, and if it doesn't cost much to throw it together, then you don't feel the need to make the script as tight. Every word isn't a slight extension to a cutscene someone has to direct and animate entirely by hand, and we've already seen a big difference in how the Prologue handles dialogue versus here, even if it certainly wasn't perfect even back then. Beyond those points, I just want to establish the types of cutscenes now so that I can more easily reference them later. The boys head towards the colony, and we get our first section of free play, sort of. At first it seems we would get to explore, but no. We walk down a corridor, and the instant we even see the colony and can turn in any direction, we teleport and lose Ryan from our party. And Ryan did tell Shulk not to run off on her own, so maybe that's the devs trying to tell us something. The Bozos return to Colony 9, and if you thought I would progress with the story of the two back-to-back tangents, you are wrong. It's time to talk about the colonies. So, back in the prologue, they were supposedly retreating back to Colony 6, which should be somewhere near the armored torso of the Bionis if they are making the journey on foot. While Ryan mentioned it being dangerous outside the colony and that they should head back to the colony, he never stated a number, and now we see that this is Colony 9, on or near the Bionis foot. The fact they are called colonies heavily implies they must have been colonized by some civilization, probably a greater empire or something along those lines. So that's an expectation we should hold going forward. There's no way you can ever convince me that Homekind's very first settlement at the dawn of their species were all following a very coherent and consistent naming convention all across the Bionis, so there must be something more going on here. Someone must have established and numbered the colonies. Additionally, since the colonies are seemingly numbered 1 to 9, maybe even further, we get a sense that whoever founded these colonies didn't value them as societies in their own right. They aren't granted names, just a clinical label, which I'm sure would make bookkeeping for the hypothetical empire that much easier. Of course, we don't know any of this for a fact yet, but it's what we can draw from the deliberate naming of Colony 9 instead of something that would invite fewer questions, like Footsville. If nothing else, I would argue that this is the line of thinking the player is supposed to have, and that everything so far would point towards there being or having been a greater home civilization that founded the colonies. Hopefully, we can learn a bit more about this from talking to the various townsfolk or from side quests. I don't expect, nor do I want, huge exposition dumps, since such knowledge should be something everyone in the world is already aware of, but context clues should help me form a bigger picture at least. Anyway, where was I? Ryan and Shulk split up for a while, and Shulk heads to the weapon development lab. The dialogue as they split up is absolutely fine, unlike their last conversation, but the voice acting makes it sound awkward and stilted.
Here we are. I better stop in at HQ. You off to the weapon development lab?
A good example of how those automated animation cutscenes can get in the way of smooth dialogue flow. There's an unnatural pause at the end of every on-screen line, while a more natural delivery would be if the lines flowed seamlessly into one another.
Yeah, when I've sold any parts I can't use. Alright. See you later.
The automated animations really don't help either. It's something easy to ignore and push past, but it's a good example of what I explained before. Shulk said in the cutscene he would sell any parts he couldn't use, and we get our shop tutorial, always nice to have. Seems all the loot icons show if they're inexpensive or expensive, which I guess is good. I've never encountered a reason to pay attention to those icons, so I don't know why they are there. Maybe a holdover from the Wii version or something. We also get a tutorial teaching us about quests, but considering we're down to just one party member, now would be the absolute worst time to go questing. I mean, we can kill stuff, with some time and effort at least, and some of these quests are just random fetch quests that can easily be soloed. However, the real reason to delay it is because it would be a shame to miss out on the rewards for any other party member we could bring. Primarily XP, but also stuff we'll get to later. Then, we get a trading tutorial too. Okay, so on top of buying and selling from shops, each NPC in the game has their own list of goods they're able to trade with you. Neat. I don't need this system right now, but I'm sure I'll have nothing but positive things to say when the time is right. The final tutorial for now tells me I don't have to trade, shop or do quests to progress the main story, but they help. Especially if you're frustrated by the game going enemies too strong when you're underleveled and undergeared for every story boss. That absolutely won't be an issue in this playthrough, judging by the amount of questing ahead of me, but it's good to know. Exploring a bit, we can go spy on this blonde chick who's cooking in her home, which causes Shulk to level up. Wait, XP? AP? SP? Affinity coins? I'll look into this when there's a tutorial. Sorry, did I say final tutorial earlier? No, I talked to this child and learned about the affinity chart, a neat feature for another time. I've gone on enough back-to-back times already, I need to get on with this. Trading with a child gives yet another tutorial, but the best thing this little girl has to offer is the shirt I'm currently wearing, so there's no apparent use for this system for now. Shulk said he was going to sell off anything he couldn't use, so we get a shop tutorial. Selling is its own window with its own tutorial. I don't sell anything though, because what if I need it later? Besides, the game hasn't convinced me that I need money for anything, so why pawn off my stuff? It's not like your inventory has a limit you'll see reached in a single playthrough anyway. Going through the town and talking to NPCs introduces us to Gemman, who, true to his name, gives us gems and a tutorial for them. We can slot these into gear to make ourselves stronger, but just like every other system we're bombarded with here, there's a time and place for me to talk about it. Continuing through the colony, right as we are about to progress the main quest, we get yet another tutorial pop up. This time telling us about the marvels of landmarks, the things we've been finding all over the place already. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of all these tutorials, to be honest. I'm still not going to go in depth about the systems yet, but largely my issue is that we don't really need these yet. I don't know what I should keep or not, so no point in selling. Besides, I don't need the money since I don't know what's worth spending it on. Sure, there are gear upgrades, but I don't know if I'll get better stuff from drops or quests yet. If you do know the game, you likely won't really care much outside of maybe purchasing some books, but since no tutorial has mentioned them yet, I wonder how a new player is expected to know. If I'm not convinced why shops are useful to me, then I'm certainly not going to pay much mind to trading. As I said earlier, this girl who is one of the first characters you can trade with only has 2 random items and the shirt Shulk is already wearing. That's the first impression to the system for many players. The developers are clearly aware of the bombardment of tutorials, so they wouldn't wait until the 6th landmark before they tell me what they are. And even then, they are intentionally leaving information out regarding them, so surely they must be worried the player is getting overloaded with information. But there's another thing I take note of while I stroll through town. Some of the NPCs have names and others don't. Named ones get registered on the affinity chart, show up on the minimap and can be traded with, while the remaining population is given far less significance. But we can talk to all of them and they do have things to say. Let's take the first 3 NPCs at the entrance. First is Dorothy, who is trying to sound like she's doing her job well, while also complaining about her brother. Second is Liliana, who says her dad is one of the stars in the night sky, watching over her at night. And lastly, there's Colony 9 resident, who seems to know Shulk, accurately guesses that Shulk has been out searching for scrap metal, and comments on how Shulk can make use of anything. 2 of them talked about themselves and people relevant to them, while only the generic, unimportant, unnamed character talked about Shulk and made it seem he's a guy who's well known around town. Interactions like that are great to ground the characters in the world, but if I had followed the implications the game had set up that these characters are unimportant, I wouldn't have seen that. And there's more that I may have missed. A nameless Nopon tells me how ether crystal formations form through pressure and heat inside the Bionis. Don't know what a Nopon is? Neither do I. An old lady tells us everything is made from ether, which is why it sometimes crystallizes inside monsters. Another woman tells us about this great curry stand. A man eating at the stand talks about how the people here are scarred by the battle from a year ago, which claimed the families of many inhabitants. A woman tells us Nopon originate from somewhere around the Bionis back. Another woman lets us know where the lab is, in case this was the Wii version and we didn't have a dotted line to follow. Another tells us of a kid who's upset and might have a quest for us. The conversations with all the NPCs are varied and gives us minor world building information, yet it feels like the game is trying to condition me into not caring about the lesser NPCs. If I could at least just see them on the map like I can with everyone else, maybe that feeling wouldn't be so strong. It took a while, but we finally reached the objective marker despite tutorials and tangents. On the way to the weapon development lab, we get some comedy as Defense Force Colonel is verbally abusing his subordinates because they crashed the mobile artillery into a house. The Defense Force Colonel then orders the soldiers to get the artillery back to the military district where we are now, but they can't because the ether cylinder was damaged in the crash and is now empty. It simply doesn't have any fuel left. They also can't simply replace the ether cylinder because they're all out and more won't come in for 3 days. I'm guessing that's a shipment from elsewhere based on the way he puts it. Considering how many specific details we're getting, it's probably important. This scene is exposition done pretty well, especially compared to before. The comedic music and the Defense Force Colonel's shouting makes it easy to just take the scene as a comedic character introduction, if you're not focusing too much on the details. The NPCs here have even more interesting things to say. A woman wonders if Mechon are attacking Homs because the Bionis attacked the Mechonis. Another tells us how Mumkar and Dumban once competed for the Monado. We can also see Ryan doing his training, being the only one allowed to wear civilian clothing for some reason. Shulk moves on to the lab and is about to start pondering the Monado, but is interrupted by Dixon. It seems he's been traveling around a lot and left Shulk in charge of the lab while he was gone. He compliments Shulk on the Monado research too, so we get a strong feeling for him being a mentor for Shulk, added on to the exposition earlier. They discuss their Monado research and Shulk mentions that if anyone else could use it, they would surpass any military force in the world. Shulk? How many other military forces do you know of? Why are you so excited to surpass them? Aren't Mechon the only threat you're worried about? For some reason, Shulk's research has convinced him the sword is something more significant than just an anti-mechon weapon, and his evidence is that there are glass panes in the hole that can show different symbols. Dunban could probably have told him that after 5 minutes of swinging it, as each art shows a different icon, but that's all the information Shulk has on the Monado, so I guess he hasn't researched it for long? At least this discussion teaches us some more about the mechanics of how the Monado functions. Anyone can activate the Monado. Dunban is the only one who has managed to control it. The Monado may have hidden functions tied to different symbols. We get a flashback of how severely injured Dunban was when he came back from the war, and he whispers something to Shulk, but we don't get to hear what. There's also that blonde chick we creeped on, who clearly worries about him, but that's not as important, I guess. At least not to Dunban, who only wants to talk to Shulk here. Our nerd looks at the Monado, and I guess we get to hear what Dunban whispered, just delayed by several seconds. Apparently, the Monado was controlling him rather than the other way around, implying it may have a will of its own. So maybe the Monado shows Dunban, rather than him having some special trait that lets him control it. He then says it's up to Shulk next, and I assume he's referring to Shulk's Monado research, which as a consequence must have been fruitless for over a year. There's no reason Dunban would imply Shulk should be the next to wield it, instead of someone with greater physical prowess and more training, especially after how seriously he himself was injured. It's just meant to be vague and foreboding, and that's about it. We're also getting our first taste of one of the more used generic cutscene tracks, Sorrow, which plays in more or less any sad cutscene. Dixon tells Shulk to touch grass, and we cut to Dunban trying to use his right arm. A year later, and it's still incredibly messed up. The woman worrying for him in the flashback is here to bring him food, and since the game hasn't introduced her yet, I'm gonna say it's equally likely she's his sister or girlfriend based on the first interactions. Dunban rejects her offer to feed him because of how well he's doing compared to a year ago. He even boasts that he should be able to wield the Monado again should it come to that. This upsets the girl, who cries out that the mechon are gone now, so again we see that she clearly cares for him. Wait, the mechon are gone now? Damn, so Dunban managed to eradicate every single one of them, and they confirmed that the mechon wouldn't be coming back. Right. Well, if that's the case, how did Shulk intend to surpass every other military force with the Monado? The Homs aren't going to start infighting already, right? Dunban then pushes Fiora to go bring food to Shulk, and we get a strong feeling she's got a crush on him. Credit where it's due, this was actually a good and subtle way to tell us they're brother and sister, by showing us their familiarity while also having Dunban push her to go after Shulk. Either that, or they aren't related, but Dunban is really into cuckoldry. Whichever it is, after she leaves we see Dunban struggle to hold a spoon with his right hand, insisting on trying it anyway, knowing full well how weak it is. Almost as if he's refusing to accept his own destiny of having a permanently crippled arm. Neat character building. We even see him swear to a photo of him and his war buddies that he has to be ready to use the Monado again, showing that he still thinks of Mumkar as a friend rather than a traitor. Also implying he fears the mechon will return, even though his sisters said they are gone. Even more character building. We get to play as Dunban's little sister Fiora to deliver sandwiches to Shulk. Dixon, who's likely here to say hi to Dunban, lets us know Shulk isn't at the lab anymore and that she should look at the usual spot. Yet another opportunity to stubbornly ignore all the quests as we are locked to one party member. Oh look, there's that crashed artillery mentioned earlier. We find Shulk at a park overlooking the colony, pondering the Monado. I guess he really does go, the Monado, every time he's reminded of it. He's telling any eavesdropper that it is in fact the only sword effective against mechon armor. Apparently they say the Bionis wielded the Monado before time began, but the Bionis is huge. How would such rumors have started in the first place? And who are these they that say the Bionis wielded it? This doesn't even clarify if Shulk's voiceover at the start was in character or not, as that one didn't mention the Monado at all. Considering this is not only a video game but a JRPG, both the first story and this one are likely entirely or mostly true, but that doesn't explain how these rumors could have been spread to begin with. My best guess would be if people revere the Bionis akin to a god due to it being the world they live on, they may consider the Monado a manifestation of the Bionis will. It is a weapon that apparently requires some form of a chosen one to wield it, and it is the only sword that's effective at killing mechon, which appear to be the enemies of all life on Bionis. While that would be a plausible explanation, you'd think that would come with a lot more reverence for the Monado overall. I mean, this is the type of stuff that religions are formed around, but we haven't seen many people care about the Monado. It just seems to be Dunban's sword which Dixon and Shulk tinker with in a lab. The people don't even have a strong enough reverence for the Bionis for it to be apparent in the culture from what we've seen so far. Benefit of the doubt, maybe we just haven't seen any Monado or Bionis worship yet, but you'd expect there to maybe be a temple somewhere in Colony 9, or some NPC mentioning it if that was the case. My suggestion only holds up if the rest of the world would match those expectations. If not, then these rumors likely shouldn't exist. When you introduce an idea like this, you need to be careful about the implications. We have a mysterious weapon that is the only reason humanity still exists, and some ominous they believe that it was once wielded by the titanic creature whose body they all inhabit. This is huge for the world and should say so much about the cultures and beliefs of the Homs, but it's completely absent. In fact, it's so absent that I'd have to go on an even longer tangent if I want to speculate for a reason for why there isn't even a small Monado church in the colony. The same goes for the colonies. The simplest explanation is me imagining that there must be a greater Homs empire that founded the 9+ colonies with some cold and pragmatic purpose. If it turns out there is no such thing, and they all just independently decided to name themselves Colony 1 through 9, then there are so many more questions that would need to be answered. But hey, I'm sure they will be. After all, the game's a masterpiece, right? Shulk begins to recap what we have learned about the Monado from the last few cutscenes, but Fiora interrupts him. The recap isn't exactly necessary, but might help along those few who somehow haven't realized the Monado is mysterious or that it takes a toll on its wielder. After Fiora shows up, we see how much the two enjoy each other's company, or at least how much Fiora enjoys Shulk's company. While Shulk is just thinking about the food and how good it is, Fiora appears frustrated due to the uncertainty of whether she's really appreciated for her efforts. Shulk remains oblivious and just keeps eating while she throws him quick glances that make her smile. How nice. But also some minor and vague death flags. Showing off how much a character means to the people around them before a large battle is a great way to make people care just before they are killed, and we're still waiting for our inciting incident that makes our protagonist leave this idyllic life behind. It's nothing massive, but her two biggest traits so far is that she's caring and she has a crush on Shulk, which immediately sets her in stone as the generic protagonist love interest that the player would root for, and which then also makes her a prime target for easy drama if she were to be killed off during the inciting incident. After all, writing an active relationship is much harder than tying a romance subplot to the beats of the main plot, or using the death of a loved one in the first act as motivation for the main character. If I try my best to look through Fiora's two scenes for character traits, I'd say she's very attention-seeking. She fished for affirmation from Dumban, and now she desperately wants Shulk to notice her, as well as showing herself being somewhat bitter when she's not noticed. The need for attention likely stems from insecurity, but the bitterness may come from not getting the attention and affirmation she feels she's owed. Of course, we got barely anything to go on right now, so we'll have to see how she's further fleshed out later on. Even more death flags appear as Fiora emphasizes just how nice things are right now and says she wishes every day could be like this, forever. Almost as if they are setting up a contrast of this idyllic moment before things irrevocably changed and the aftermath of the inciting incident to come. We hardly know her yet, so many may not be invested in her as a character at this point. If you're not invested yet and you picked up on those death flags, it would be perfectly understandable if you decide to emotionally distance yourself from her, as she may not be long for this world. But who knows? Maybe she lives and the people who spotted her death flags just had their investment in this character ruined for no reason. Okay, maybe I'm getting too hung up on the death flags, but on the other hand, disregarding the death flags, there isn't much more to this scene. Fiora brings Shulk food, showing that she's caring and that she likes Shulk. Shulk likes the food and says it's better than usual, which shows that he cares enough about Fiora to actually notice that the sandwich is different from normal, instead of just taking it for granted like she feared. This plays into her earlier comment about how Shulk has no taste, which was highlighting how she was worried Shulk wouldn't appreciate her, and now she's relieved that he does. Fiora tips her hand a bit by bringing up how she put extra effort into it and was hoping he'd notice, but backs down when Shulk is oblivious to what she says. She glances at him and smiles, just showing further how she likes him. She comments on how she enjoys this moment, and Shulk agrees, even if it seems he didn't appreciate it at first. Fiora comments that Shulk spends too much time with Ryan, but it's not clear if it's due to jealousy or just a friendly jab, as Fiora and Ryan's relationship is unknown to us. Fiora says she wants every day to be like this, likely in large part because these peaceful days allow her some precious personal time with Shulk. It's literally just character building, but without really building any characters. It's great that we get to see their relationship, but the entire scene feels shallow and like they could accomplish more here. To be clear, the problem isn't just that the scene only exists to set up her death flags. It's that they blatantly wave the flag around by having the characters practically turn to the camera to tell the player that this is a nice and idyllic moment in an overall peaceful life, and it sure would suck if something were to disturb that peace. They couldn't have the confidence to just show us a heartwarming scene that plants the thought in our subconscious that things are so nice here. No, Fiora has to say it's nice here, or the player may not get it. And just like with the Rhine scene earlier, imagine if they had spent some of that dialogue establishing their peaceful lives to instead just establish some actual chemistry between the two. Wouldn't that be neat? The debris siren saves us from hearing these lovebirds literally talking about the weather, and they decide to return to the lab as these huge anti-air batteries disintegrate debris falling from above. Yeah, makes sense this would be needed if the majority of the world is literally above you. Anything falls from the knee or the sword and it would cause serious damage to your colony. Neat. And no, I won't get into yet another speculative world-building tangent about how these cannons don't match the rest of the colony, at least not yet. After this bonding moment, we fittingly get a tutorial to the affinity system and heart-to-hearts. Sometimes during battle, a party member will get sad, but you can walk up to them and press A to make them less sad, and gain affinity with them, meaning they like you more. Sad party members are pretty useless as they can't really hit anything, so it's important to keep patting them on the back. Conversely, if things are going well in battle, everyone will be hype, which is good for the fight, but it does mean that you can't emotionally manipulate your party members into forming an unhealthy attachment to you as you let the same enemy make them sad over and over again just so they can feel affection for you when you finally cheer them up again. Fun mechanic, taught me how to make friends in real life. While battling is only one way to get affinity with your party members, there's plenty others, but this tutorial only mentions pressing A on sad party members in combat. So, what's all this affinity used for anyway? Lots of stuff, but the game so far only tells you about this little mechanic called heart-to-hearts, so we'll focus on those. In fact, we get one right away, so let's watch it. Fiora asks Shulk about some memory that's very important to her, and we have to help Shulk with the correct answer to get bonus affinity. The first choice is whether they came here because Shulk invited her, or because of something to do with Fiora and Dunban. Shulk would clearly never ask her to spend time with him, so it must be option 2. Correct. It had nothing to do with Shulk. But oh no, as they spent all night looking at the stars, Fiora asked Shulk to marry her, and now she's worried he might remember that embarrassing moment. How very cliché. Question 2. Does Shulk remember what she said? Now, even though you saw her clearly worried that he'd remember, don't let that fool you. She wants Shulk to remember, so don't pick the line about fishing. The correct answer is kind of, even though he clearly doesn't remember and Fiora just brushes it aside. So, that did much more for the characters than the entire preceding cutscene. This is the formula for each heart-to-heart. You get a conversation between two characters, you get 2 sections where you pick 1 out of 2 dialogue options, which tend to reward you for understanding the characters well. The most die-hard fans may want to explore all the ways conversations can go, while most players will have a good time simply striving for the best route. Picking the right option gives you bonus affinity, but no matter what, the scene itself will give you a lot. So that's a neat little system. But for the first 3 playthroughs of this game, this was the only heart-to-heart I ever saw. And I won't elaborate on that yet. You're going to understand in due time. Back at the lab, Ryan is touching stuff he isn't supposed to and can't control the Monado's power. So we see what happens when anyone other than Dunban tries to wield it. Almost looks like it's trying to shake him off, doesn't it? It cuts through everything with ease, but bounces off Fiora, giving us another rule on how it functions. The Monado can't cut people. Ryan doesn't know it can't cut people and thus worries for Fiora. Fiora's in disbelief that she's unharmed, but states she's fine. Shulk, who knows Fiora was never at risk, instead worries about the large machine that was cut to pieces. And then the dialogue nosedives for the rest of the scene. Fiora whines about not getting attention from Shulk, even though she admits to being unharmed. Shulk then lashes out at Ryan, but somehow he's very specifically upset that Ryan thought he'd be here, not that he wrecked the lab with the Monado. He does point out that the Monado is dangerous and that they must be careful with it, which is very unnecessary repetition for the player, but apparently vitally important information for Ryan, whose pecs must cut off oxygen from his brain somehow. Despite both seeing it for himself and being told within the last 30 seconds, Ryan still wonders whether or not the Monado can cut people, cementing his permanent himbo status. Shulk's answer is completely unrelated. He tries to explain something about the symbol that shows up on the Monado and how it determines which power the Monado is using, which is either implying there's a human cutting power, or has nothing to do with what Ryan said. This is also repetition of what we already knew, but go on. Ryan's only response is wondering why he thinks the symbol is a symbol. Shulk is then about to say what he'll do if he can increase the number of symbols on the Monado, only to be interrupted by repeated whining from Fiora about how she's not the center of attention. I had no strong feelings about her before this scene, but man, they are growing. Intimidated by Fiora, Shulk backs off and a slight bump makes the Monado activate in his hands. He gets a vision of events we cannot make sense of yet, though we can at least analyze the voice lines as that's what will likely stick with the players. Someone taunts,
"Look at you, worthless without the Monado,"
possibly implying the characters might lose the Monado and be unable to fight Mechon. Another character, likely the woman on screen judging by the lip sync, says,
"Till I've scrapped each and every one of you!"
which makes it sound like she wants some Mechon genocide. The delivery makes it sound very personal too. Shulk says,
"So, of course I want to get my revenge!"
implying there's something he will want to get revenge for. Could be anything, but they've really done a banger job setting up Fiora as his motivation, so things aren't looking great for her. Finally,
"Your blade, it did not cut deep enough."
while the visuals linger on some Mechon claws dripping with blood in Cold 9. So, the impression I get is that we'll get a revenge plot, meeting up with more characters who want revenge, and possibly with Shulk blaming himself for not being able to go far enough to stop the Mechon. Even if the "your blade didn't cut deep enough" line doesn't correlate with the visuals there at all, that's the impression it leaves. Though it all flashes past so quickly that most players wouldn't be able to make much sense of it, and may come out with different ideas of what to expect. Of course, we don't know for sure that these are visions of the future, but I'd say that's the safest bet we can make. Regardless of what the vision depicts, we can add two new rules. The Monado can grant visions. Time appears to stop for the duration of the vision. There's a seamless transition between cutscene types thanks to Shulk's vision, now that the second half will likely be nothing but talk. Nice and economical decision. It's clarified that only Shulk saw the vision, it didn't happen to Ryan, and we never heard of Dunban being granted visions before, so it may be that the Monado is oddly selective in who it reveals the future to. More notably, the Monado didn't try to force Shulk to drop it like it did with Ryan. Does this mean that he can control it like Dunban, or does he have an even greater affinity for it? There's some minor conflict between Ryan and Fiora after Ryan comments that only Dunban can use the Monado. Fiora won't let him touch it ever again and gets mad at Ryan, so that just makes it more unclear if they are friends or not. Shulk says that this stuff has happened a few times before in the long time he's been researching the Monado. I assume he's referring to the incident as a whole and not the vision, judging by his reaction to it. And also by the fact he's not telling the others about his vision. They changed the topic and Ryan explains he came here to ask Shulk's help, as the Defense Force Colonel ordered him to go to some ruins and grab some ether cylinders as punishment for being late. This ties into the scene we saw earlier regarding the wrecked mobile artillery, as Ryan recants with much verbosity. The punishment also included a beating, as well as 1,000 squats and sit-ups, telling us the Defense Force Colonel must have thought Saitama's training routine was for weaklings. Shulk agrees to come, and Fiora is upset because it would be dangerous for Shulk, and she doesn't have any faith Ryan would protect him. She did mention earlier that Shulk was spending too much time with Ryan, and now she outright states that promise means nothing coming from him. I wonder what sparked this animosity between them. It seems entirely one-sided since Ryan's disappointed she doesn't trust him. I'm looking forward to seeing this conflict unfold. We get tutorial pop-ups saying we can now level up arts and learn skills, so let's mention that briefly. In that tutorial battle before, Shulk only had 2 normal arts, but there are way more. Most are unlocked at high enough levels, but on occasion they will be locked behind story progress. Most characters will unlock a total of 16 arts over the course of the game, but there's only room for 8, meaning the player must select which abilities to bring. But on top of that, killing things and discovering landmarks will grant art points, which are used to level up arts further. Due to the points being somewhat limited without a heavy grind, the player needs to think carefully about which arts to level up, prioritizing the ones that the player find most useful. It's basic but serviceable character customization. Besides this, there are skills which are far less interesting right now. Each character has 3 skill branches with a linear progression through them. Pick a branch, get a minor stat buff from the branch, and spend all skill points acquired in the same way as art points into that branch passively. It can shift your playstyle a little, I guess, but it isn't great for customization, at least not yet, but there's more to be unlocked in the future. To get to the ruins, Ryan and Shulk must go through some caves, where Fiora is already waiting for them somehow.
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
She's got the transport cases they forgot. She's decided to keep the cases on her as she's coming with them. No idea why she didn't just say so from the start, but okay. Apparently, this is another sign that she doesn't trust Ryan, likely because she insists on protecting Shulk herself instead of leaving it to him. We enter the cave and learn that some enemies attack us on sight, others go on sound, and others won't attack us until we attack them. This is denoted by the different icons by their name. Neat! This place is a short dungeon with lots of hostile enemies and occasional unique monsters that are either directly in our path or slightly off to the side. There's this first one that might attack a lower level player, but it can easily be avoided if you take a side passage, which leads above the nest and to another unique monster, thus combining an alternate route with some rewards for exploring and going down both paths. After that though, the cave continues linearly for the rest of this chapter. Inside the cave they reach the ruins. Turns out no one knows who built them or how. Shulk suggests it may be a large vehicle embedded in the caves, but can't say for sure. You can confirm this from the outside that it is indeed a vehicle that's embedded itself into the mountainside. And even Shulk is amazed at the kind of technology it contains. So, whose vehicle is this? An easy assumption is that this might be whoever founded the colonies, but that would mean the colonies have no clue why they are named as such, nor who founded them, and thus their knowledge of their own history would have to be very limited. Besides, I'm curious what makes the technology in the ruins so amazing compared to the huge and seemingly automated cannons protecting the colony from debris. They share an aesthetic, so they might share origin. Even if the cannons are foreign, they still have the means to maintain and repair those mobile artillery units, so the level of technology must still be somewhat high, even if the colony seems to be lacking any major factories that could produce all the parts needed. Unless, of course, all the parts for the mobile artillery units were crafted by hand by some blacksmith. Doesn't matter for now though. Since the game drew attention to the mystery of the ruins though, I'm assuming we'll get our answers regarding it later. We get a tutorial about skip traveling to any landmark we've encountered, which the game says is good for selling stuff while exploring. But I've never had any inventory issues in this game, which is odd. I'll look into this later. We will, however, make use of the skip travel feature to go back and do some side quests now that we have the entire party gathered and we've covered the cutscenes here in the caves. But first, now that the entire party is gathered, I think it's time to talk about character introductions. You can do a lot to establish relationships with just a few lines, and at this point we have more than just a few between our party. We know Shulk and Ryan are friends, and that's it. We know Fiora likes Shulk, but that he doesn't seem to notice her much, and we know that Fiora and Ryan don't get along. If we count the chat between Shulk and Ryan after the tutorial, the talk between Shulk and Fiora in the park, and their conversation in the lab up until the vision, we have around 520 words of dialogue between the three of them. This isn't counting the few words before the battle tutorial or the second half of the lab cutscene, since it was more objective focused rather than character building, and also doesn't count the scene with Fiora and Dumban since the two party members weren't in it. I'll still take those scenes into account for my assessment of their relationships, but for the most fair and generous word count, I'll say 520 to establish the relationship between these three. That's a travesty. 520 words and we have no more than this. I don't think there's a better way for me to explain how much better they could have done this other than by showing similar scenes in other games for comparison. Let's start with Xenogears, an earlier title by much of the same team behind Xenoblade. Not counting a foreboding scene of possibly future events, the first we see of the protagonist Faye is that he's painting and decides it's time for a break. We see him in action doing something defining for the character. We sorta get this for Shulk too, which is earlier search for scrap, but because we can't tell if he's intending to sell it, turn it into art or develop machines, we end up needing Shulk to tell us instead, which is slightly weaker and uses more words. Faye goes upstairs and can interact with NPCs if the player is so inclined. Otherwise, when exiting, a little kid named Dan goes through the door. Dan is looking for Faye. Another guy, Timothy, tells him not to just barge in and be rude, implying a position of authority over him. Dan is upset that Timothy is here, making it clear he doesn't like him. Dan tells Tim that he doesn't have to listen to him, at least not until Tim is married to his sister. A natural reason for stating their relationship, and we get a good idea of both what the relationship to one another is on paper and how they feel towards each other. Dan desperately wants to talk to Faye alone about something and doesn't want someone to listen in, clearly referring to Timothy, but not mentioning him by name to reduce the chance of eavesdropping. The dialogue is natural and perfectly establishes the relationship between the three other characters, as well as between Faye and Dan. After Dan leaves, Faye and Timothy talk briefly and seem to be on good terms. Outside, Dan does have somewhat clunky dialogue, reminding Faye that his sister, Alice, is getting married tomorrow and telling Faye exactly how he feels about him. But he at least has a reason for it. It's an argument to convince Faye to run away with Alice before she marries Timothy. Faye then goes to speak to Alice for unrelated reasons. The music cuts out and she speaks with ellipses, implying she might not be very happy right now and that there's something else on her mind. After an awkward silence, they both start speaking at the same time, clearly having something to say to each other, but both end up reconsidering and backing out. All of that in the first 5 to 10 minutes and with less than 450 words. You can of course get even more of this early section if you talk to Timothy before leaving the house. Meanwhile, the 520 words we've gotten in Xenoblade accomplish far less, telling us way less about the characters, and does so with clunky dialogue that doesn't sound human. So despite these characters having the benefit of voice acting and detailed models that can show subtle emotions, there's less to latch onto. The scene with Faye and Alice alone have 55 words between them before the topic changes to your quest objective, and that conveys the relationship so much better than the 150 words between Shulk and Fiora on the bench. But maybe that's unfair since the characters and dynamics are a bit too different. So let's look at Kingdom Hearts. 1 girl, 2 boys, all of them teenagers and with some romantic tension thrown in for the hell of it. Can't get much more similar than that. Sora has a tutorial dream foreshadowing the events of the game and wakes up on a beach. Kairi expected Sora to be taking a nap at the beach, showing that she sees him as a bit of a slacker. Something about his dream made him wonder about her hometown, which she doesn't remember. He's clearly a sentimental person as he still wonders if she wants to go back there, despite her just stating she has no connection to it. She isn't particularly invested since she's happy here, but he is curious enough that she wouldn't mind seeing it anyway. This prompts Sora to chime in that he also wants to see it. And every other world too. This can either be read as him exaggerating in his agreement of what she says because of how he feels for her, or simply that he is a bit naive and ambitious with his goals, but either way there's an implication that he'll take her there one day. The third member of the trio shows up, Riku, slightly irritated that he's being left out, implying there might be some jealousy at play. He's also annoyed that he's the only one actually working on the raft that will take them from the island. He even chides Kairi for being as lazy as Sora. So of the trio we have Kairi and Sora, who are both lazy dreamers, but Sora being far more ambitious. The two are similar and have chemistry. Then there's Rico, who's the most pragmatic, focusing on taking action rather than simply dreaming, but because of this he feels left out. The entire franchise in a microcosm. All that in 152 words. Remember, Fiora and Shulk on the bench, even after I cut out Shulk's Monado monologue, is just as long but accomplishes so much less. But I have one more example, just for the hell of it. This one has the most clunky dialogue of the lot, but that only makes the comparison all the more fitting. And this one also has a big redhead muscle man, a pasty blonde nerd, and a girl, so a great match for Xenoblade. Atelier Ryza, Everdarkness, and the Secret Hideouts. As I said, the dialogue here is incredibly clunky and expository, but it still does a better job establishing the characters and their relationship with each other. The game starts with an opening segment of Ryza introducing herself to the player, which I'm just going to call Lazy. Ryza tells us she is a normal farm girl in a normal village and she's desperately waiting for something interesting to happen that could end her monotonous day to day. Even though I find it lazy to have the character break the fourth wall to introduce herself, the introduction itself is both well written and well acted to convey how mundane her life is and how bored she is with it.
なんてことない島のラーゼンボーデンっていうなんてことない村。そこでなんてことない私は暮らしている。なんてことない日々を変えたいと焦がれながら。
Then switching to excitement as she speaks of her hope that something will break the monotony and how she longs for adventure.
なんてことない農家の娘。そんな私は今日も今日とて屋根裏にある私の部屋で仲間たちと密かな計画を話し合っている。この退屈ななんてことない日々を打ち破る痛快で素晴らしい計画を実現するために。歓喜も迫る青くて深い夏の空は絶好の冒険日和だ。
It conveys very clearly how she feels and why, and the acting in her introduction here makes her immediately endearing. Cut to a scene in her room. Ryza is venting about her father nagging her about the wheat crops. The big muscly Lent comments that Ryza's mom yells at her when she talks back to her dad, which scares even him. A neat parallel with Ryan, but where Ryan is scared of his superior officer in the military, Lent is scared of Ryza's mom, showing he's not as tough as he looks and telling us more about him than the similar statement did for Ryan. Tao is barely paying attention to the conversation and instead wants to talk about some book with pictures he can almost make out. Ryza is confused about his fascination with all the books in his basement even though he can't read. Tao informs everyone what they already know, that his grandpa died before he could teach Tao to read. Again, very clunky, but at least that clunk is used to establish endearing traits. While Risa is confused about his determination, Lent says it's admirable. He notices that the book is dirty, and Tao says it's because Bose and Lumbar spotted him and pushed him into some mud. No one is surprised, so those two are clearly regular bullies. Risa proclaims she tolerates them being snobs, but not the bullying, which means the bullies are likely nobility, rich, or otherwise upper class. Lent confirms this by informing everyone what they already know, that Bose is the son of the guy who controls the village's entire water supply. While clunky as fuck, this both explains why Bose is able to get away with anything and will actually be an important plot point later. Risa is mad just talking about them, so she changes topic to plan an adventure to the mainland, showcasing her adventurous spirit that was shown in the opening. Tao points out that she's the one who got them off track with her venting, which both shows she can be a bit scatterbrained and that Tao is the type of nerd to go, actually. Lent shows emotional intelligence by telling him not to poke the bear, and then distracts Risa with word that some mainland merchant is arriving today. She fixates on this and insists they will go check it out, deciding to steal a boat and cross over to the mainland to see them arrive. She steamrolls any objection from Tao, and Lent sympathetically tells him that there's no stopping her now. These two scenes were very wordy at just over 470 total words, but that is still less than the 3 scenes highlighted from Xenoblade combined, and still informs us more about the characters' relationship to one another. This is what can be accomplished by tightening up your script. Squeeze as much meaning as you can into every line of dialogue so that there is more importance than simply what's being said. The reason why characters say what they do also matters a huge deal. Not only that, but as a writer you have full power to create any context you need for the conversation. If the mainland merchants hadn't been arriving today, Lent couldn't have used it to distract Risa, which means that entire branch of the conversation wouldn't have happened and we may have learned less. Ryan and Shulk have nothing to talk about in their scene other than the immediate events. They fought 2 monsters for some scrap. Ryan's break is almost up. That's it. Same with Shulk and Fiora in the park. The sandwich tastes better than usual. That's it. Then they start talking about the fucking weather, which is the most blatant signal ever that they have absolutely nothing to say to each other. As a writer, you can dictate anything that's currently happening, recently happened, or will happen soon. Maybe Shulk noticed some new mechan parts in the junkyard that wasn't there last week. Maybe the Defense Force is planning an expedition into the Mechonis soon. Maybe there are planned Monaldo tryouts. Maybe Fiora needs to vent her worries and frustrations over Dunban's condition worsening because of an insistent to train his damaged arm. The possibilities are endless and there's absolutely no excuse to introduce us to the cast by showing them struggle to find anything to say to each other. But we won't have time to think more about that for a while now. This is where we take a break from the story for a while. I mentioned earlier how having just one party member made questing much harder and less rewarding, and that still held somewhat true when we had just Shulk and either Ryan or Fiora for a single brief jog each. Now that we finally have all 3 at once, we should turn back and clear as much as we can to see what this game has to offer. There's even a heart-to-heart here that requires just a little more affinity between Shulk and Ryan as an extra incentive, so let's go. To make up for the lackluster character introductions, the game works very hard to give the player a strong impression of the characters through gameplay. Part of this comes from playstyle alone. Shulk is somewhat tactical with his positional arts and other situational ones he'll unlock later. Ryan is a meathead tank who takes aggro from the others and hits enemies with straightforward physical attacks. Fiora has arts with incredibly long cooldowns, but make up for it with a strong talent art that charges up fast thanks to her rapid attacks, which shows her as somewhat weak but an opportunist in battle. But the main way gameplay shows off the characters is through battle dialogue. Every character has voice lines for nearly every occasion, which shows their general attitude. When starting a battle, they have different set of lines as party leader or as partner. The former set of lines has them take command, while the latter has them responding to the leader instead. Not only that, but the battle start lines differ depending on the enemy level compared to your own, and also if the enemy is a type that is favored or disliked by the character. To show the difference between characters, Fiora says,
"Don't get careless,"
when she's in the lead and attacking a weaker enemy.
"Is everybody ready?"
when the enemy is of the same level, and
"If we don't try it, we'll never know,"
when the enemy is higher level. So when the odds are in her favor, anxiety kicks in and she worries about the risk of losing and ends up being very careful. When the odds are against her, she's filled with confidence. Compare this to Ryan, who's equally cocky against stronger enemies, but has absolutely no consideration for any potential risk when attacking enemies of equal or lower level. It's a nice touch that helps flesh them out. Although, the downside of the formulaic nature is that characters often tend to say similar things to each other in the same situation. As partner, both Ryan and Fiora have similar lines for enemies of varying levels. They are unsure when attacking something stronger, excited when fighting something of the same level, and cocky when fighting something lower level. The devs tried to break this formula in some places by having short specific exchanges between the unique character pairs during the fight. This happens for elevated tension and party gauge, but there can also be short post-battle conversations that are pre-scripted for the active characters, which is neat. Beyond character building, these lines do serve a gameplay purpose. They can help a player follow the flow of battle by drawing their attention to what's going on. If a character calls out their low health lines, you may notice they aren't healed or that the aggro is wrong. If an enemy joins the fight or dies, it will be called out. When tension goes up or down, it's called out. If party meter is filling up, you'll hear it. All the characters even call out their arts by name so you can track roughly when attacks are used, and thus you may know when they can happen again. If you just heard Ryan shout, "Wow, down!" you know he just wasted his topple, so there's no point expecting it anytime soon. For the sake of varying up the gameplay sounds, there are multiple callouts per art, but they only mix it up for the one you're playing. So allied Ryan will always shout while down, but when controlled he'll alternate between that and "You're going down!" After all, you know what button you just pressed, you don't need to be told which one it was. To a degree, this adds noise pollution to the combat, but I think it enhances the feeling that the party is truly working together to overcome their enemies. Speaking of, now that we have 3 party members, we unlock the party gauge used for chain attacks and reviving party members. It fills whenever you successfully land positionals, crit, or successfully manage a button prompt in a fight. Those button prompts have a small chance of triggering when anyone crits or misses an attack, making it based on a lot of very frequent low chance events, which balance out over the course of a battle. The party gauge drains slowly out of combat, but that means you can still keep most of it by quickly jumping into a new one. Or perhaps you fight some weaker enemies before a boss to start off with a little bit of an advantage. Or maybe you just wipe to the same boss over and over again, keeping your party gauge between attempts so that you can start with a chain attack. 1 bar is used to revive a fallen party members, and 3 bars are used for the chain attack. These chain attacks are really powerful. Time passes momentarily and each character takes turns to use a single art on the enemy. All their arts come off cooldown for this, so you can use whichever you want. With every art of the same color used, you get a damage boost which multiplies your damage output significantly. So using an art late in the chain is better than using it early, but you need to make sure you chain only the same color arts for this bonus. They are color coded based on type though, so generally this means only red physical arts or purple ether arts. Though since talent arts are colorless, they can be used to switch color mid-combo if you want. However, talent arts are the only arts whose cooldown is not automatically reset, so you have to time things right. Additionally, since all arts come off cooldown, this is a pretty good time to inflict break and topple without having to wait for another party member to act. Since break arts are pink and topple is green, these won't continue the damage bonus chain, so you must choose between the strategies. Topple them or build up damage multipliers. Once your 3 rounds are up, there's a chance to get 1 more attack. This repeats now after every attack until you either aren't offered a new one, fail the button prompt, or reach the maximum of 15 attacks. The 4 factors that affect these odds are where the party falls between sad and hype on the tension meter, how much affinity your party members have for one another, how well you did the last button prompt, and if you have some specific skills unlocked. Overall, the system is pretty simple, very strong, and hides all the complicated factors as to not confuse beginners. There's a little bit of strategy in it too, like which arts to choose, and if you want to use a strong art now or pray that the character gets another turn so they can use it with a bigger damage bonus. And this mechanic isn't just for boss fights either. Killing an enemy switches targets to a new enemy, and all your area attacks will get the full damage multiplier on additional targets too. My only criticism of this system is related to affinity, but that is a discussion for much later when all the pieces are in place. Gotta lay the foundations for that critique before I can let loose. So, we're free to do what we want here. So what do you do when you're not just walking from cutscene to cutscene like we have so far? Well, there's a whole world to explore. The map starts out blank and we fill in areas as we visit. As previously mentioned, there are landmarks all over the place, and when we find them all, we're rewarded with getting the full map filled in. While exploring, there are these shiny little collectibles on the ground that we can catalog in our Collectopedia, sell or trade. The Collectopedia is a record of all collectibles in the region so that we know what we found. There are even neat little tidbits about the items we find. Fill out a full category or a full page and you get a reward, usually a piece of gear or a gem. So those are some decent incentives. A slight issue with the system is that you will likely only complete 90% of it naturally while exploring, assuming you're thorough, and there really isn't any in-game way to track what you're looking for. External sources reveal that there are a ton of spawn points for collectibles on every map, but not every one is active at all times. Each node has a random chance to grant you certain collectibles, so there are some general areas where you're more likely to find what you need if you know to go there. However, there's no convenient way to make these respawn, so if you empty an area of collectibles and still don't get what you need, you either have to look elsewhere while you wait for respawns, or you return to main menu and reload your save. There are of course also a bunch of monsters all over the place, and we can fight them if we want. Monsters drop chests of loot when killed, though these mostly just contain ether crystals and materials. Ether crystals will be relevant later, and materials are mostly just vendor trash you can sell for money. It's an extra step for the player, but it's much more immersive than having some bunnies dropping huge piles of dosh. Occasionally you'll also get gear drops from monsters, which is less immersive than a pile of cash, so I guess I'll have to retract my previous comment. Finally, there are unique monsters. Despite Xenoblade X's attempt to rebrand them as Tyrants, a much cooler name, Unique Monsters is the name that stuck for the entire franchise. These are much tougher enemies with more moves than the rest of the fodder in the world. While fighting them is a greater challenge than most other fights, killing them also tends to give good rewards, including the so far unexplained affinity coins, so it's definitely worthwhile to hunt them down. The area surrounding Colony 9 is pleasant to explore. All outdoor areas in the game tends to have an energetic day theme and a soothing night theme, which greatly enhance the experience. Considering this is still the starting area, the map is naturally a little bit closed off. From Colony 9 you have a closed linear path to where we started and another one to Tephra Cave. Beneath them both is a great beach which nearly goes in a full circle, though is stopped at this cliff that can only be passed in one direction. If you dropped into the lake after Shulk and Fiora's park bench scene, you would likely have discovered Cliff Lake, this somewhat hidden area with a unique monster slightly too strong for us at this point, and that's where you can access the top side of the cliff to drop down onto the beach. To the east of the colony...
Those cliffs in the distance! You can actually go there.
Yes, we hear you, Todd Howard. After a long swim, there are two small areas, Hazai Cape and Agora Shore, with enemies much too high level for us, so exploring there is dangerous for now. Though if you want to finish filling in the map early on, you got no choice but to go there. A nice touch that will give us reason to go back here later and makes exploring risky and exciting. Overall, the map outside the colony is pretty varied and offers lots of different paths to choose from to get to one point to another. This is what I would consider a perfect example of the design goals that lead to interesting level designs. It might be intuitive that linear maps are boring because they offer no exploration, while large open areas are great because the player can go anywhere. Except, if the area is truly large, open and empty, the player will have a clear line of sight to any point of interest. The player will also be able to run in a straight line to any spot they want, meaning there's no thought that goes into how to traverse the map. The Colony 9 area, however, features many interwoven paths the player chooses between. Some, like the corridor to the tutorial scrapyard, is entirely linear and offers no option to jump off, but then the route to Tephra Cave allows the player to jump off into the water on either side of the one-way cliff path. Not only that, but there are occasional ledges which must be navigated around when taking the path, but only in one direction, and perhaps it's even worth making U-turns to get up a ledge for a monster or collectible. Between any 2 points on the map, you will generally have multiple choices for how to get there, and it's hardly ever a straight line. The intricate nature of the map also makes it so you can't always see from a distance if there's something interesting in another part of the region. That, in turn, gives greater purpose to any high ground you can find to look over the world and plan where to go. The only pain point on the map is the amount of water, but it also serves to enhance the level design in its own way. Swimming is awful and slow, thus you want to minimize time spent in the water. So every time you want to reach the strips of land on the eastern edge of the map, you must think to yourself what the best route is to minimize time spent in water and if that route is close enough to warrant the detour. There are also limits to where you can jump into the water, making it trickier to figure out the best way. But exploration isn't all about level design. Along the northern edge of the map, there are a few spots of land that really don't contain anything worth noting, and swimming there is a pain. So these spots could be very frustrating for players who go out of their way to explore. Since this game doesn't appear to have any treasures in the world, the only rewards one could hope to find when exploring is either a landmark for map completion or a unique monster that may drop something neat, which does limit the developer's ability to make each spot of land memorable. I guess there's also the more intrinsic rewards of a great view, but those need to be used sparingly to avoid diminishing returns, and it's also very clear at a glance that some spot of sand by a wall isn't going to be breathtaking. Then there's the issue of skip travel. Every landmark on the map is a point we can effectively teleport to. The teleportation isn't canon, the characters took the long route, But to the player, there's no difference. This means there sometimes isn't any reason to engage in the level design where you can just skip travel to where you want to go. Thus you won't end up deciding the best route from your current location to your destination, but from the closest landmark. It saves the player a ton of time, but makes traversal less engaging. Funnily enough, this makes the least accessible parts of Colony 9 all the spots beyond the water, meaning the only time the game doesn't let the player save some time is with the slowest and most tedious stretches that can be traversed in the area. How very fun. But the landmarks can hurt exploration beyond removing a need for route planning. You can usually guess the landmarks will be in the unexplored dark regions of the map, and you know you found them all when the map becomes fully visible, meaning you can safely stop exploring them. The only other thing to find after all are unique monsters, and you have no way to know how many they are, where they are, nor what conditions they spawn in. So unless you use a guide, you may as well not bother looking and just deal with the ones you stumble into. Or will you really search this entire area in case there's an enemy who only spawns during thunderstorms at night? Moving on, let's look at the colony itself, which has a day and night theme just like the surrounding area. It feels very homely, and you can imagine that everyone knows everyone here. The population still had to be padded with nameless NPCs, but that's not a huge crime. The colony is split into 3 sections: the commercial district, the military district, and the residential district. A very believable split. Dumban lives at the main entrance to the colony near the commercial district, which must be one of the best plots to live on in the entire colony, but also puts him as the first line of defense should they be attacked by ground forces. A neat touch, and the only sign that Dumban is valued by the civilians. The residential and commercial districts even have some minor side paths to them. In the residential district, the path splits in 2 around these houses, but there's also a dead-end path on the outside facing the water. In the commercial district, there's this warehouse that gets you both up on some of the rooftops and a path facing the water, but also a walkway that goes above large sections of the district. While most people may not give it a second thought, having all of these extra paths for players to find and use makes the town a lot more engaging to explore and traverse. It's great level design that helps the player engage with the town layout and learn how to get places. Then there's this central plaza with a huge pillar that covers the choke point that splits all 3 districts. There is no other way in or out of the military district than this, making it very defensible as well as very convenient for the game's cutscenes. However, as there are entrances from the wilds into both commercial and residential districts, you can easily get between the 2 by going out of the city. This is why we had to be teleported to Colony 9 when we first saw it, because the developers wanted us to be introduced to the commercial district first. When the developers don't force the player into a specific path, we can, for example, take Fiora out of the main entrance and miss the entire mobile artillery crash. The path between the main and side entrance also leads further into the park where Fiora and Shulk had their talk. Considering the park is placed outside the colony proper, it's probably pretty safe for citizens to walk outside, so long as they don't stray too far, which is reflected in the lack of hostile enemies here. Looking at the map with the knowledge we now have, Shulk's introduction fits pretty well with what we know. They are on the foot of the Bionis, so debris sometimes falls from above, including from the sword. This could even be entire Mechon. Considering the park is outside the range of the anti-air batteries, the wreckage at the start is certainly unaffected too. The only question that remains is how this place hadn't been stripped clean already. Maybe the Mechon there were new, somehow, but if that's the case you'd expect someone to comment on it, as it could mean the Mechon are returning. Probably not worth dwelling on too much though, but it certainly feels odd. But I've stalled long enough with just the exploration. Of course it wouldn't be much of an RPG without side quests, so let's talk about NPCs, area affinity and quests. In the menu, you can find something called an affinity chart. This both shows you the party affinity, how much your party members like each other, and your area affinity, which represents your standing with the people of the region. Higher area affinity will unlock more items from trades and more side quests. You increase your area affinity by interacting with people and questing, so I'm sure you can see how this is a loop that feeds into itself quite nicely. Although I did say earlier how we had no reason to trade with people, and that also means we have very little reason to talk to them. Of course, many JRPG players have a compulsion to talk to every NPC in the city to learn all they can about the lore, and that's an instinct that will serve them well here. To get this loop going, the player needs to take the initiative to engage with the world itself and try to get to know all the townsfolk. Though it's not quite so easy. Here's a spreadsheet showing every NPC in Colony 9 and what hours of the day they are active. When active, some wander while others are static, but close to the start and the end of their active periods, you will likely find them wandering to or from their usual spots. But you see, the deceptive part about this sheet is that time moves while you run around to speak to everyone. 1 hour of in-game time is just a minute for the player. As the NPCs are spread around the entire city, some will despawn and others will appear while you are looking for them all. You even have some characters like Werner here, who is actually active 24 hours per day. But he's standing at the Mechon wreckage, which you already explored in the tutorial, so you may never think to return there. You cannot see an NPC on your affinity chart until you talk to them. Only afterwards can you look them up to see what they have to trade, what hours they are active, and where to find them. But that's only after you've already found them the first time. Since you don't know how many you're missing, who you're missing, or when they're active, speaking to everyone without a guide is lunacy. But you still want to do that. You get area affinity the first time you speak to an NPC, as well as whenever they have something new to say. Some quests are locked behind having unlocked someone on the chart too, so you may not want to take any chances. It's best to just get them all. Not only that, but some NPCs will trade you that one item you're missing from the Collectopedia or need for a quest, so you want to be able to search for what they have to trade. Sometimes you even need higher area affinity before they will trade it, so you better go unlock it all, and remember to check what everyone trades every time area affinity goes up. I like the idea behind the system. These NPCs all have interconnected relationships that will unfold as you do quests for them, and that makes the world feel alive. That party members sometimes have special dialogue with the NPCs both in and out of quests help even more with believability. Giving them all their own daily schedules helps with immersion, but makes the compulsion to speak to all of them a lot more frustrating. Maybe even such a small fix as letting us see their schedules and what they have to trade before we speak to them could be enough to fix this. Then those who compulsively want to speak with everyone can track them down without looking at a guide online, and more casual players can simply look up whoever trades the rare meat cabbage they need for a quest. So what about those quests? The priorities to make the world and party feel alive can be felt through the quests too, to a degree. When accepting a quest, you'll often have the party leader say one of a few appropriate comments, which another party member will respond to. Each party member has 2 possible responses to each comment, meaning no matter what your party leader just said, you will get 1 out of 4 responses back, depending on your party setup and which specific comment was said. The party leader then has a single comment answer to whatever they said. Very similar to the quick exchanges during combat. At its best, these comments can flesh out party dynamics and make it feel like the quest isn't just an NPC monologuing at us. At worst, you'll play Shulk a little too much and notice how often he says "sounds like you got a problem," to the point where it just becomes silly. Though those repetitions is how we got stuck with Rhyme Time and Shulk really feeling it as memes, as well as a few others.
To you! To me! Alright!
So I guess it's not too bad. All those comments actually grant affinity between party members, which is nice. What's less nice is that the 2 responses the party members can give have different amounts of affinity tied to them, making it unreliable. What's even less nice is that you can technically re-roll your comments by repeatedly declining the quest until you get the high affinity line from the party member you wanted. Though that's absolutely not worth doing, even if it's fun to see that the party has the exact same type of comment system with lines that undo the affinity gain you already got. Then there's another type of quest dialogue. Most quests have one specific party member that will actually engage in a conversation with the quest giver, with the dialogue being written specifically for that quest. These flesh out the character and the world far better than the generic ones do, even if your average player will miss most comments. But let's now look at the quests themselves. There are a total of 41 quests available before we continue the story. Quite a lot. However, many are generic quests given by nameless NPCs. In Colony 9 alone, we have Monster Quest 1 with 3 parts, Monster Quest 2 with 3 parts, Monster Quest 3 with 4 parts, and Monster Quest 4 with 3 parts. 13 quests in total that can all be summed up as, "These enemies are giving us trouble, please kill a few of them." There's often some reason given for why you have to do it, but they're barely worth reading and it doesn't come from a real character, just a generic nameless NPC. The game is really making me discriminate against them here. There are also 4 challenge quests, which are quests to kill a unique monster, 4 material quests that ask us to bring in some monster drops, 4 collection quests which ask us to bring in some collectibles, and finally 4 search quests that ask us to find a specific item that's hidden somewhere as a red collectible orb. So that's 29 out of the 41 quests we can currently do that aren't given by a named character and don't really have a story attached to them. There's also no comment on these quests, neither generic nor unique, and we don't even have to go back to turn them in. Not even the quest to find someone's lost wedding ring. And that's close to 75% of the quests so far. That's not a very good start. What about the 12 remaining quests? I'm going to regret this, but I will cover every single quest in the series. I have some strong opinions on them, and I will make some wonderful sweeping statements, but I think it's only fair that I show all the data I base my conclusion on. It's easy for me to show 3 good quests and say they're all good, or 3 bad quests and say they're all bad, but if I show all the quests, that should paint a clear picture of what they are like. While doing this, I'll include unique comments when I can, but very often we won't have the right party member when doing these quests, so let's briefly go through the remaining quests in the colony. Old Man Dionysus has back pains and wants some brog oil to ease the pain. Kill brogs, get oil, return. Now his back feels better. So some of the unique quests from unique NPCs are just as bad as generic ones. Great. Giorgio has almost run out of ingredients for making the curry he sells at his stand, but he doesn't have time to go fetch more ingredients. We get him the apples he needs. Please tell me they aren't all like this. Marcia's grandchildren are having an altercation and they are both training to beat each other. She's rooting for the younger one since he's not adopted. Give him some cookies so he'll train harder. Fiora is upset at the notion that Grandma here plays favorites with her family, but Marcia just replies that Fiora wouldn't understand. We bring him the cookies and return to Marcia to complete the quest. Not a very interesting quest. If we want, we can talk to her other grandson, a Noppon named Zakusaku, and he's upset Marcia hates him. That's not part of the quest, but makes the otherwise very dull quest more entertaining. Desiree has broken her watch and needs Shulk to fix it. She refuses to speak to you unless Shulk is the party leader, which is a bit of an awkward way to do it, but I see what they're going for. Shulk's the inventor, so he wants him to fix it, no one else. Again, it helps make the world feel alive, even if it's a minor detail. While accepting the quest, the conversation steers a bit towards Desiree's late father, who seemingly was a blacksmith and who was great with machines, unlike Desiree. We go to the lab to fix it, but lack materials. Get the materials, fix the watch, and return it to Desiree. She's thankful and says she broke it on purpose just so Shulk would talk to her. She's just kidding, of course. Unless... We can talk to her afterwards to hear about her friend Becky, who she's drifting apart from. It's not part of the quest, but it's one of those sneaky new conversations that adds bond to the affinity chart and consequently gives you more area affinity, even though you thought you had already exhausted everyone's dialogue. I won't cover these lines except for where it's relevant, but I felt it important to highlight how the relationships between townsfolk are alive and evolve over time, even if the implementation can be detrimental to the gameplay in some ways. It's also nice to see Shulk repairing stuff, even if it's just for a side quest. I don't lament that it's as simple as gathering the materials instead of a full minigame. Crafting systems do often tend to get in the way if not handled right. It's nice to see either way. A soldier captain named Emmy Leiter wants us to look for Miller, who's slacking off. Miller is her only subordinate, so she really can't ignore him. Since Ryan is a soldier, he has some lines to add, but it doesn't give us a clear picture of who outranks who of the two. We find Miller, and despite everything Emmy told us about the effort he puts into skipping work, he just goes back right away. Return to Emmy, and she tells us Miller promises not to slack off again. Emmy finishes with a strange line about how she can finally move forward to achieve her dreams. The Noppon Nera doesn't have any friends and is too scared to ask this kid Lucas to be his friend, so instead he wrote a letter and wants us to give it to Lucas. Deliver the letter, and Lucas says he always wanted a Noppon friend. Return, and Nera is happy to finally make a friend. Holy shit, a quest chain! Lucas is worried for Nera because their other friend Moritz asked him to get a Crabble shell, so now the Noppon ran off to Hazai Cape, one of the high-level areas to the east. Nera did manage to get a shell, so once we speak to him, he teleports back to Colony 9. Speak to Lucas and he's happy Nera is safe. Moritz apologizes to Nera and tells us he won't make fun of the Noppon no more, and he's actually impressed with the Noppon's skills. It's not much of a story, but it's something. It has characters from the previous quest be involved in a new quest, and I guess that's neat. Susanna's son doesn't like studying, so she wants our help. She wants us to get some sweets as reward for his studies. We get some nectar from Tephra Cave and turn it in. Holy shit, another quest chain! Giving her son candy only helped him study for a short while, but he quickly started just eating the candy instead of studying, only to go play when he had enough. On an absolutely unrelated note, she wants the party to grab some heavy bunnive iron for her. She needs it for exercise, yeah. We get the stuff and turns out it was for study after all. She tricked us. Canonically, according to the quest log. These guys are dumb. Rocco broke his mother Sonia's pendant, which was a gift from his dad. Now Sonia is so upset she only makes horrible mush for dinner, so Rocco needs us to fix the pendant before his tongue falls off from the awful food. No worries, Shulk can probably fix it right oh no, never mind. Shulk suggests someone else can do it. I sure wonder what the damage must be for it to fall completely outside of Shulk's expertise. We find Dean, who agrees to fix the pendant as a favor for Shulk, since they are both craftsmen. By that, I of course mean he'll tell you to sod off unless you're specifically controlling Shulk again. Dean recognizes Rocco as being Sonia's kid and suddenly insists we make sure to say he was the one to fix it. Return to Rocco and he's happy Dean fixed it. In fact, he almost starts to idolize Dean. What's this? Another quest chain? Dean is calling in a favor for fixing the pendant earlier, and he wants a date with Sonia, Rocco's mom. He's too embarrassed to ask her himself, so we gotta do it. Sonia would love to go on a date, but has no time because of her kids. The other day, they saw a gecko, and since then they've kept fighting over who saw it first. So if we get them a gecko each as a pet, she would have time to go on a date. We get the geckos and she asks us to tell Dean that she's free for their date whenever. Dean goes to get ready for his date and implies he's gonna get lucky. We fade to black, then return and, he didn't get lucky. Just a very quick dinner. But hey, she asked him to babysit for her and he plans to use that as a chance to get closer to her. Now that Sonia is dating Dean, her daughter Liliana is worried that her mom is forgetting about her dead husband. Liliana's dad left something in case Sonia was ever in trouble and we have to go get it. We swim over to a dangerous spot and have to abuse the AI of this high-level unique monster to get past and pick up the item. We hand it to Sonia. It was a recipe she wrote down for her late husband before they married. He had said he would like to eat her food for the rest of his life, so she wrote down the recipe. He had then gone down on one knee and said, "I'm proposing to you, you silly nincompoop." She tells us she will never forget her husband and that she feels like a bad mother for causing her daughter to worry so. We chase down Liliana again and she's happy they can be a family once more. Not sure what that means for Dean though. Sweet but inconclusive. So, 29 generic quests. And then the remaining 12 are of low enough quality that the only one I could call at all compelling is the last question with Dean and Sonia. The rest are at best mildly amusing and at worst indistinguishable from the generic quests. What may be worse is how these 41 quests really didn't tell us much about the world. It's just general everyday townsfolk problems with no connection to their unique situation, world or culture. Not saying every quest needs to be some massive lore dump, but without the added flavor of this unique setting, they all feel generic. And what may be even worse than that is that these 41 quests really do nothing interesting enough to justify why a person should read the quest text. The actual gameplay of doing the quests themselves is a pretty menial task. Kill thing, find thing, talk to person. Nothing more. So they need to be carried by the writing. But there is no quest here great enough to convince a player why they should always pay attention. In fact, they may encourage a player to stop reading all side quests as there appears to be nothing there. Now that we are nearly done with the side content, we can loop back around to the Collectopedia and trading. While getting a nearly full Collectopedia is trivial, there's always those last few items you can't find. For me, the last item missing was a chewy radish, so let's see how I could go about finding it. This picture here shows a map of which areas I can find it in, with the best spot marked in blue and the worst ones in red. Some of these points are just a single crosshair, which signals it's a single fixed spawn of one collectible, while a larger field means one or more spawns of this collectible within a fixed radius from one point. The largest of these even spawns 6 total collectibles. This information is not visible in the game whatsoever, so you either look it up or explore blindly until you find it. If you go with a blind approach, well, that blue point has a 100% drop rate for a chewy radish. 2 of these fields have 25% drop rates, 4 have 6% and the rest have 10. On top of that, the 25% and 6% spots are only active at night, making them very easy to miss. So unless you lock upon the guaranteed spot or one of the spots with 25% drop rate while they are active, you are going to struggle quite a lot. For reference, here's a map of where you can find one of the most common items in Colony 9, which should showcase just how many different collectible points there are scattered across the map. Successfully finding that one chewy radish you need while going completely blind will take you a long time unless you're extremely lucky. Thank you to the Xeno series Wiki for these references. Okay, so you might not be able to find that delicious chewy radish. Lucky for you, there are 3 people in Colony 9 willing to trade them to you. Finally, a practical use for the trading mechanic and a reason for me to explore it. I mean, you could have used it for the side quests, but Definitive Edition shows a dotted line even to the specific item orb with the collectible you need, so there really is no reason to bother. Find the person who trades the radish and you'll see it costs 4,500 gold. I have more than enough money to just pay them, but no. You must trade any item or collectible you found with an equal or greater value to the item you're trying to get from them, but only one item at a time. It doesn't matter how many 3,000 gold value collectibles I offer, they will not accept the entire pile in exchange for one radish. So you better find some valuable material or some of the other rare collectibles if you want to trade yourself this one. But hey, it could be so much worse. Remember how every named NPC has their own unique list of items to trade? Sometimes an NPC could be the only one who trades a specific item, so you really can't afford to miss filling out the affinity chart if you want to do a lot of trading. But since NPCs can trade items not native to their area, you gotta scan through all of them if there's something you want. And in some funny cases, they do trade what you want, but only at a higher level of area affinity, meaning you may need to do more side quests. And then there are the funny instances where a character moves due to a side quest or main story, sometimes just temporarily, and they have an entirely different set of trades in the new location. And then there is overtrading. Luckily, this isn't much of an issue for collectibles, as there are very few of them only available through overtrade and not regular trading, on top of those few not being particularly rare elsewhere to begin with. That said, this system has some apparent issues unless you're going to look things up online. Every NPC has a secret overtrade item. If that item is worth 2000 gold, then you must make a trade with them where you effectively overpay 2000 gold for the item you traded. Unfortunately, these overtrade items are always hidden from the player, meaning that the two options are trial and error or looking it up. Unless you really want the overtrade item, you don't have a reason to overpay, so you're not exactly incentivized to find out what they have to offer. Besides, if you overpay by 2000 gold and their item is worth 2001 gold, then you get nothing and just wasted your item. I really don't see a need for the overtrade system to exist, other than to sometimes recognize that the player just overpaid greatly for the trade. But maybe that could have been better solved by letting us trade quantities. But then again, doing that would nullify the challenge in filling out the entire other tab of the Collectopedia, which is filled with extremely expensive items that can only be acquired through trading. Now, except for the other tab collectibles, you don't ever need to use the trading mechanic. All the tradable items can be acquired elsewhere, but that just leaves the mechanic really hard to use for casual playthroughs, as you'd never know who can give you what without either looking it up or looking at the full list of NPCs. You need them all added to the affinity chart to meticulously check them whenever you'd need something. My best faith interpretation is that this is supposed to give the townsfolk more identity than simply being names with quests to hand out, and maybe it's even meant to lead to the player feeling a greater sense of camaraderie with these characters, but that's not how it ends up feeling. In reality, players will simply Google where to farm soggy biscuits for quests in a late game zone, only to find that Jimmy Bingus will trade them to you for 1200 gold after you get to Colony 9 to Affinity level 3 and he has temporarily moved there from the Bionis Arscrack throughout the course of his quest that you can complete in 30 seconds. And so you instead start farming moist capybaras, as that's the best collectible to trade in for the biscuits. I guess I'm glad this mechanic isn't very obtrusive, but I still wish it could be better. While exploring for all these quests, we will find random heart-to-hearts spread throughout the area. One in Dunban's house, one in the residential district, and one back in the Mekon wreckage. But we can't even see who's part of them yet. Alright, no spoiler, gotcha. Guess we're gonna have to return here a lot then, because otherwise these things are going to be forgotten by the time I can see them. And yes, I know you can find a list of them tucked away in the menu next to collectibles, but somehow I managed to miss that for several playthroughs. And so did every friend I asked. So I'm going to use that anecdotal evidence to say it's not quite enough to make the player see these. There's one by Tephra Cave entrance that we can now finally see thanks to all the side questing though. That and Shulk and Rhine starting at 90% of the way to their second tier of affinity, otherwise we might not have unlocked this one yet. I may as well cover it now, since this could be the last heart-to-heart unlocked and discovered organically as I play. Shulk and Rhine talk about how they have been through a lot together, as all friends do every couple of weeks. Rhine then asks if Shulk remembers that one time, because being any more specific means the players wouldn't have to guess. The correct guess here is that Shulk and Rhine had a big fight. They never fought like that before or since, but now neither of them remembers what they fought about. Rhine asked if Shulk ever thinks about it, and the correct guess is to mirror Rhine to say yes. They both agree that they likely wouldn't be friends now if it weren't for that fight, since it helped them get over their differences. Rhine used to be really irritated about how smart Shulk was, and Shulk used to think Rhine was just a dumb brute. And, now Rhine is okay with Shulk calling him a dumb brute. I guess we learn a bit about their history, but it's a bit unfortunate that this doesn't characterize them much more than affirming that Shulk is the smart one and Rhine is the unsmart one. Now, with all of that complete, we head back into Tephra Cave and check out the mysterious ancient ruins some more. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. Something here looks like a bridge of a ship, and one of the control panels is blinking with a red glow. A warning light, perhaps? There are automatic doors here, but one of them is locked and glowing red for some reason. Feels like something isn't quite right. Continuing through the dungeon, we get to a hangar full of cylinders, ignore the unavailable heart next to it, and start grabbing the cylinders. Ryan thanks Shulk but not Fiora for the help, possibly showing more of their conflict. Apparently, the anti-air batteries and mobile artilleries are standardized for the type of cylinders they find up here, giving a little bit of credence to the idea that much of their technology is salvaged and at best reverse engineered. It also takes them a long time to make their own cylinders, combined with a high failure rate, so taking them from this hangar is preferable. Shulk, while ignoring Fiora completely, says the ruins may have some technology that preserves it. Ryan finally thanks Fiora and she passive-aggressively tells him to go here on his own from now on. Which again just hints towards their strange conflict. She would rather risk Ryan dying than have Shulk dragged along to make it safer. Shulk is then distracted from rambling about the technology as two machines appear to attack the group. Some sort of defense system, perhaps. This is our first boss fight of the game and shows some of the major weaknesses of Xenoblade combat. I doubt there are many players who can tell you what mechanics this boss fight has. While the combat is real-time, these games don't exactly deal with telegraphed attacks you can avoid, which makes fights on the surface appear like a simple competition between the stats and build of your party versus the stats of the enemy. How well you execute your arts of course plays a big role, but few fights require more thought than that. However, the truth is that there are tons of mechanics taking place, many of which can be planned around and preemptively countered. These two drones have three major attacks to watch out for: a cone attack, a line attack, and a circular attack. Because of this, the ideal way to handle the fight is to have Ryan tank both enemies, while Fiora and Shulk get rear and side positionals for one enemy. Preferably, while the other is 5 or more meters away, so they can avoid the circle attack. Unfortunately, you can only control one character at a time, so trying to micromanage positioning is very hard, but at least there's an ideal setup to strive for, which would minimize damage taken by the party. On top of this, the drones will switch between attack mode and guard mode. In the former, they deal and take more damage, in the latter they deal and take less. So on top of the somewhat unattainable goal of the perfect positioning to avoid their attacks, you would also want to keep switching targets to attack the one in attack mode, partly because you deal more damage to them, and partly because it's the bigger threat. Of course, if you are a few hits from killing one of them, you may want to take that chance instead. Lastly, the drones have final defense mode, which makes them hit harder and faster. And I mean a lot harder. While the normal attack mode is only a 35% increase, this is instead double damage, on top of the faster attack speed. I would assume this only happens at low health as a sort of enraged state, but it's hard to tell, so I've never seen it happen. This could have been a really strong first boss fight, but it isn't. Getting your party members to do what you want is really clunky, but worse than that, you really don't need it. Multiple unique monsters in the cave before this point are much harder to defeat, and the only time I have ever struggled to defeat these machines was when I tried to see how feasible a zero side quest run was, which still only led to me being underleveled by a single level. If this boss never challenges you, you have no reason to learn their arts and no reason to engage with their mechanics. It's really a shame. After we defeat the twin machines, Shulk speculates along the same lines as I did, adding that it likely wasn't the bozos who caused them to activate. And almost as if on cue, the Mechon attacked the colony. Likely, that's why the machines activated. Whoever built this vehicle were clearly prepared to fight Mechon. Interesting. Maybe that was also why the lamp was blinking and the door was locked. Not that I have much of a clue why the defense system would lock just that one door and nothing else. Regardless, it appears the townsfolk are screwed. Oh, and Fiora actually thought Dumban wiped out all the Mechon a year ago, which is a logistical insanity. So, this is pretty weak so far. Cool high concept and all, but now that we're in the world itself, the setting appears so incredibly dull. The side quests are mediocre, main story hasn't kicked off yet, and the character writing is upsettingly bad. And I can't emphasize that last point enough. Even after finishing Chapter 1, taking every scene into consideration, we know very little about any of the characters, where they fit into the world, or what their relationship is to one another. Shulk is obsessed with the Monado, completely lacks social intelligence, and tinkers with machines. Okay, that's something. But every time he thinks about the Monado, it's, I hope I can understand what it be one day, not anything concrete tying into his research. Though it makes sense considering his research has only discovered that the symbols displayed when Dumban does Monado arts are displayed on different glass panes, and that there are more panes that might have other symbols. On the bench, we get so close to world building as he says they say it was wielded by the Bionis. But the writers can't take the extra step of implying that he's been poring over ancient scriptures of an unknown civilization or whatever. Considering there are no signs the Monado has any cultural significance to the Hom, despite alleged rumors that the god whose corpse they live on once wielded the very sword, it must be someone else, right? What are Shulk's relations to other characters? Well, Dixon is his mentor. We know this because he states it outright. And then there was that one scene where Dixon complimented Shulk's singular Monado discovery, if we can even call it that, and Shulk replied that it was all thanks to Dixon's research. I guess Dixon's research was a napkin where he wrote, Dumban make different symbols with different arts. What about his relation to Dumban? Well, Dumban wants Fiora to end up with Shulk, and Dumban entrusted the Monado to Shulk for some unknown reason. Shulk and Fiora? She likes him. He appears to be oblivious, but seems to like her too. Well, that sums up the relationship for Shulk. Fiora also adds being frustrated about Shulk not showing interest in and paying attention to her, and worrying about Shulk a lot. Shulk and Rein? Close friends, and Rein looks out for Shulk a lot, I guess. That's it. Hell, even when Rein was having a Rein moment and fucked up in the lab with the Monado, Shulk only expressed frustration that Rein would assume Shulk was in the lab all the time, even though we specifically told him that's where he'd be. There's neither frustration from Shulk about Rein acting this way, nor forgiveness for what Rein did. Both would characterize their relationship. Instead, the event is practically ignored. Does Shulk have any other connection to the world? No. As far as we know, he's orphaned, homeless and unemployed, spending all his time at the lab or looking for junk. Hell, Fiora is the only one here with a home and family, though only a brother. Everyone else could have been spawned into this world last week, considering how few connections they have to it. There's little point in me even discussing who Rein and Fiora are at this point, because their relationship to Shulk pretty much sums it up. And most I can add that Rein is a meathead brute archetype and that his primary occupation is military. Private? Sergeant? No clue. Does he have a home or family? No clue. But of the main trio, there's one relationship left. Rein and Fiora. The only way I can read their relationship is that they are only acquaintances because they are both friends with Shulk. They do not have a single scene between just the two of them, and what little they speak to or about each other is hardly friendly. First, Fiora says Shulk is spending too much time with Rein, which may not mean much in a vacuum, or might just be jealousy. Then, Fiora calls out Rein in the lab and he ignores her, and only reacts to Shulk. Rein does ask if she's okay after he fails to cut her, and she responds she's fine. Then all attention is on Shulk and they only talk to him. When Rein comments that only Dumban can use the Monado, Fiora snaps angrily at him and he apologizes. When Rein asks Shulk to come with him to fetch the ether cylinders, she disapproves because Shulk could get hurt, clearly only caring about the well-being of one of them. Even when Rein promises to protect Shulk, she spitefully replies that a promise doesn't mean much coming from you. He points out Fiora doesn't trust him, and then the only sign they were actually friends before now is Shulk, the oblivious man with zero social intelligence, assuring him that she doesn't mean what she said. Not a trustworthy source. Finally, at Tephra Cave, she shows definitively she has no faith in Rein and she insists on coming with to protect them. At least they have a dynamic going, I guess, but how is anyone supposed to believe they are childhood friends after this? So, is this fundamentally broken? No. That's why I felt the need for such a long section with so many examples. Had it truly been awful, then that would be easy to show and there would be few people praising it. I'm just trying to show that even if these characters develop and improve a lot from now on, we are 4 hours into the game thanks to all the side content, and only have the most surface level understanding of our main cast with very little chemistry between the characters. What we have is fine at best, but it can be so much better, and I'm so happy Monolith decided to keep improving the writing despite so many people praising the mediocre character work and dialogue at display this chapter. But at least the first chapter is over now. The inciting incident is upon us as the Mechon invade Colony 9, and finally the story can pick up some momentum that might make up for what's lacking so far. The Mechon come from above, with carriers dropping units from hundreds of meters in the sky. The Defense Force Colonel asks the reasonable question of why literally no one noticed the Mechon approaching, and we're giving a simple explanation. Everyone believed Dumban had single-handedly wiped out all the Mechon somehow. Just no. There's no possible way this is a reasonable thing for anyone to believe, unless there were expeditions into the Mechonis to make sure they had cleaned up completely. And since people did believe this unreasonable idea, that makes me further question Shulk's line about surpassing any military in the world. The Monado can't cut people as we now know, and all Mechons were thought dead, so the sword would be utterly useless. It could only ever surpass another military in its ability to kill Mechon, and if they were thought to be gone, then the Monado would actually be significantly worse than even a bloody stick. Whatever the townsfolk believe, the Mechon are now back, and I can only assume they are here for the Monado. After all, the only line we have been given about their motivation was Mumkar telling us they were off to the Monado. While he's shown to be an idiot and is absolutely not a reliable source, it's the only explanation for their actions we've been given by the writers. These mechon are led by a boss-looking big mechon we haven't seen before, who's also completely immune to even the anti-air batteries. Its intelligence is displayed in both how it intercepted a blast aimed at presumably a more vulnerable carrier mechon, as well as by how it's prioritized taking out one of the anti-air batteries before it could do some damage. The cutscene ends with Dumban getting out of bed and limping down the stairs. Is he getting the Monado? Now, many players would see this as a great opportunity to test if water negates fall damage like in most games. Some may have already confirmed this at the park, but now there's some actual utility to it. A great way to use the level design to teach game mechanics without a pop-up telling the player what to do. The normally peaceful music surrounding the colony has been replaced by the stressful crisis theme, and the weather is changed to a unique raid weather to set the tone. Shulk, Ryan and Fiora return to the colony, only to see the residents being slaughtered. The soundtrack changes to the same battle theme used against the mechon in the prologue to show the increased urgency. Shulk proclaims they are eating people, which would explain the lack of corpses. Despite there being numerous types of mechon with different weaponry, here we only see ones with tri-split claws. Claws that we see are hollow and big enough to hold an entire person inside when closed. Which is exactly what they do to every person we see them kill. Is this what Shulk means by eating them? Unless the homes are being digested in there, it seems more like a means to capture them rather than an effective weapon. Mechon don't even have discernible mouths, so I don't see what else eating people could mean. They did this capturing trick back on the sword too, but there we also saw the occasional energy blast used to kill soldiers, which might mean a change in strategy. Maybe that's why they have been biding their time for a year, but to what end? Why do they need captives? While Fiora checks in on Dumban, Ryan and Shulk take on a single mechon, which is significantly harder without the use of the Monado. It's doable, but you need to topple it to deal any damage. Until now, they have only told you that you can topple enemies and let you experiment for yourself, but now the game will force you to topple as it's a vital mechanic in the game. Pretty neat how seamlessly they integrated this. And looking back in the prologue battle, the only time we saw a mechon killed by common soldier was after being toppled. Nice touch! My guess is that the in-universe reason is that you can't easily hit their weak spots between armor plating while they're moving. You have to topple them to effectively deal a coup de grace to their weak spots. Their joints, their wiring, all that stuff. The game doesn't explain this reasoning, but I think it's straightforward enough inference that we don't need it, and I actually appreciate having to connect some pieces myself. Now unfortunately, saying this fight was harder than the fights where we had Monado is only somewhat true. This mechon is only level 6, while the boss fight in the cylinder hangar were 2 level 8 enemies. In fact, this one enemy has less than a third of the health that either one of the 2 machines from the hangar had. It deals less damage per auto attack, only has 2 single target arts, and of course there's only 1. This enemy is downright pathetic. So while a challenging version of this fight would have you struggling to stay alive while desperately trying to get a topple so that you can get a few hits in, the version we got has you topple it as soon as your AI party member will allow and take it out immediately. Should you somehow fail to topple it by messing up your timing, the fight is still trivial, but you gotta wait for your break and topple art to come off cooldown. Again, the difference between this design being exciting or frustrating is down to how challenging the fight is for you, which largely depends on your level. And in this case, you are practically guaranteed to be too strong for this fight, considering what you had to defeat a mere 5 minutes earlier. When the mechon has been slain, Fiora returns alongside the Crisis soundtrack with the news that Dumban is gone, as we saw earlier. None of them make the connection he may have gone to grab the Monado, likely so that it can be a surprise for the players that didn't pay attention to his talk about being ready to use it again. Instead, we're gonna go fetch it. Because Shulk apparently has to remind Ryan the Monado can take out mechon. Had it been tough to take on a single mechon on its own, the task of getting through the entire city that's swarming with them would have been rather engaging. Instead, you're likely strong enough that fighting mechon is a tedious chore. Either way, the game will still teach you the same valuable lesson. You can avoid a lot of tough, annoying enemies by simply running away from them. Another important lesson the game doesn't outright tell you is that enemies can't follow you into cutscenes, so the quest marker is your safe house. The twin layers of the commercial district here are used to great effect since we can use the upper walkway to ignore a lot of mechon down below, rewarding players who take in their surrounding and who learn the layout of the colony. That walkway is far more narrow though, so avoiding the few mechon up there is harder, making it a more interesting trade-off than any objectively better route. In the military district, we see the befaced mechon leader come face to face with the Defense Force Colonel, who fires a huge blast at point-blank range, which sends himself flying backwards. Guess all that oxygen went to his mustache rather than his brain. He's then pinned by a mechon, which is almost certainly a death sentence unless someone bails him out. Then, he gets a tank thrown right at him, and it seems to hit with perfect accuracy, though we cut away before we see the Defense Force Colonel smeared along the ground. Then the tank explodes while presumably on top of him. I would say there's no possible way anyone could ever survive that, but I'll give him the same benefit of the doubt that I gave Mumcar. No corpse means no death. Unfortunately, while perfectly survivable for a home, the exploding tank ended up destroying the entrance to the lab. It took them 18 seconds to notice, which is funny, but this means no Monado for us, unless someone went in and grabbed it before we did. Plan B is to run south and grab that mobile artillery that needed refueling, since we have the fuel with us. Then we could blast our way in. Worth noting is the track that plays here accompanying Ryan swearing revenge for the Colonel and the guys. Rage, Darkness of the Heart. While the scene isn't particularly tragic for the player, it's meant to signify this moment's relevance for Ryan, as his squad has seemingly been wiped out and he's sad to have lost, well, the guys. Considering the other two don't even acknowledge Ryan's loss, and Ryan doesn't seem to know the name of the dead, I don't think that this was the best place to introduce the track though. But overall, it's still used remarkably well throughout the game. I also love the dual nature of the track, as it starts off as a dark and sorrowful tune, but then shifts into higher tempo, which almost gives the feeling of a call to action. It shows the transition from grief to thoughts of revenge and finally into acting upon those. Although for now we're only hearing the first section of the theme. More on that as the game goes on, I suppose. But really, whose idea was it to have Ryan mourn the loss of the guys? There's no evidence of any particular person being dead, so he has no clue who, if anyone, has fallen. You can easily have him worrying about his comrades instead of just making him sad an unknown number of generic guys may or may not have perished off screen. Tragically, the city planners decided the only convenient way to the residential district would be through this inconvenient choke point, and now we're surrounded. Shulk and Ryan stay behind so Fiora can grab the artillery. After some whining, she agrees to leave Shulk in Ryan's muscular hands, closing the arc of the Ryan-Fiora conflict and proving that she actually does trust him. Wait, that's it? It was barely anything! Why tie up the only thing defining her relationship with Ryan unless... Oh. Farewell, Fiora, we hardly knew ye. The Mechon are remarkably good sports, just waiting around outside the circle until it's their turn to fight us. In the prologue, they all rushed Dumban and friends at once, with the only exception being ones that were preoccupied in the distance. But there's no way we'd be able to handle that now, so... The writers decide to outnumber and surround the party, while the designers can't follow up with the real consequences of that decision. After some fighting, the tip of the funky Eiffel Tower above them is broken off, blocking the exit south, so now they can't follow Fiora for backup. But I'm sure it's gonna be fine. The fight takes a turn for the worse, but then Dumban shows up and one-shots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or so Mechon. Pretty impressive for someone who can't even hold a spoon, but I guess he gave up with the whole destiny-defying insistence on using his right hand and decided it was time to lose all function of his left one too. Combat animations show him preferring his right hand over the left one, but I suppose I can overlook that as it's just a holdover from the prologue. Would have been a neat touch to change it, but fine. The last few kills are trivial now that we have Dumban and the Monado by our side. We get a quick glimpse of Fiora reaching the mobile artillery, confirming its location for those who didn't spot it before or don't recall the layout of the colony. Time to exit the city and run all the way around it to get to the residential area, because the city planners were really proud of their bootleg Eiffel Tower choke point. And honestly, considering how well the entire colony functions as a dungeon, I can't blame them. On the bridge out, the Monado decides it's torture Dumban o'clock, making him keel over and cough up some nice child-friendly structural gel. That's a new addition to Definitive Edition, by the way. The blood was red on the Wii. There's something amusing about watching destiny-defying Dumban insisting he must use the Monado and that he has no choice. Since Shulk could hold the Monado before without it throwing him off or torturing him, he picks it up. Dumban insists that we'll kill him, but from what we can tell it shouldn't be much worse for him than for anyone else, and Dumban could wipe out enough Mechon for people to think they went extinct before it cost him his arm. Even if it's just for now, Shulk should be fine and we have no reason to believe otherwise. As soon as Shulk activates the Monado, he gets another vision. This time it shows the immediate future of how he'll be killed by the Mechon unless he evades their incoming attacks. I guess that confirms that the jumbled mess we saw earlier was also the future, albeit a more distant one. It seems Dumban never saw the future using the Monado, so perhaps it has greater ambitions for Shulk than it ever did for Dumban. Also, while Ryan's body went numb after the incident at the lab, Shulk feels okay. While not exactly a surprise, it seems our protagonist Shulk is the chosen one and the only person who can win the fight against the Mechon. Perhaps a bit tropey, but it works and explains why Shulk and his friends will likely have a greater effect on the world than any other bozo. The three group up to take on all the Mechons surrounding them, and fortunately Dumban is a huge weeb who brought a katana from his vast collection as a backup. Once we reach the residential district, the face Mechon blocks our path, likely having finally tracked down the Monado. Turns out this mute metallic monstrosity is called Metal Face, according to the divine wisdom of the boss health bar. Guess Nintendo of Europe really didn't want to keep the Japanese name for some reason. Even the Monado doesn't work against Metal Face, which Shulk suspects is due to the LED gaming rig lights all over his chassis. Looking over the Monado rules, we spot two possibilities. Either we have to add yet another rule to the list, or this face Mechon counts as being Homs. Perhaps that's why the Mechon are all focused on eating people instead of killing them with their energy weapons or their vast array of melee weaponry. We're not expected to be able to beat him since he's seemingly immune to break, and the story continues even on a loss. Metal Face slaps the entire party with his electrified taser claws, which is enough to keep us grounded. Just as it seems we're out of luck, Fiora shows up with a mobile artillery, which luckily requires no training to operate. But then, Shulk gets a vision that she's going to die while he's just lying perpetually tased on the ground. With the previous visions, he was able to dodge the attacks he saw, but there's nothing he can do about Fiora's actions, and so after shooting Metal Face in his metal face, she wrecks the artillery, gets slammed into a wall, impaled by 4 taser claws, is thrown at least 10 meters into the air before crashing into the ground, and is then eaten by a swarm of Mechon. Wait. Eaten? So there's no corpse. That makes 3 probably not dead characters so far. Surely at least one of them has to be dead. I'd say Mumcar has the best odds of still being alive since we never saw any damage inflicted on him, and Fiora and the Defense Force Colonel both took far beyond fatal damage. I love the visual of Metal Face's claws being covered in Fiora's blood, as it really helps drive home just how bad the situation is, but at the same time it really makes me question why nearly every other instance of blood in this game is black, even when it drastically takes away from the scenes. Boss Fight Phase 2. Since we can't actually harm Metal Face even with the Monado, we have to use all reliable, toppling. However, Metal Face and many other bosses are practically immune to break unless performed within a chain attack, meaning the game is now forcing us to learn how to use chain attacks to set up topples. I really love this. The story perfectly justifies putting the player in a situation where they are forced to learn the basics of the game mechanics in order to progress. This shit is extremely hard to do, as it not only requires the narrative and gameplay to be in perfect sync, but you also need to create a specific narrative situation to justify it. Simply going up against some dude and being told we have to chain attack him wouldn't work as well. I could brute force that with normal damage. Unless, of course, the game forces me to chain attack in order to win, but then that wouldn't feel particularly fair either. What probably makes this a lot better is that we've gotten plenty of time to learn these mechanics organically through experimentation before the devs decide to quiz us on our knowledge. I can't blame any game for failing to do this, but I massively appreciate when any dev pulls it off. After a good chain attack, we shift into a cutscene. Shulk does an anime and cuts Metal Face in the face. I thought the Monado couldn't harm him. Or did Fiora's point-blank cannon blast damage his face enough that it no longer registers home? I'm gonna have to assume the latter somehow, as it would otherwise be pretty strange inconsistency no matter how inconsequential. And this is already somewhat ignoring how the LED lights that allegedly make Metal Face register as a home apparently don't work if he's lying down. I doubt Shulk could stab a regular home with the Monado just because they were sleeping. Maybe he's still going for weak points that don't have cool gamer glow? Whatever. Also, I guess wielding the Monado just gives you anime physics now. Maybe I should add that as one of its rules. Anyway, Metal Face sees the rest of his kin retreating and does the same, even though he's impervious to practically all harm and could easily kill Shulk and take the Monado right now. Just slap him in the face with the taser claw that immobilized the entire party before. Or what, is it on cooldown? The fact that he doesn't go for the Monado must mean they didn't come here for the Monado at all, and likely don't even care anymore, if they ever did. But if that's so, then why come here? Was it just to capture people? I guess we can expect a lot more of these near-invincible face Mechon in the future, huh? Before Metal Face leaves, he makes eye contact with Dumban for way longer than is socially acceptable. Since Dumban hasn't really done much for this entire fight, there must be another reason. Perhaps the Mechon recognizes Dumban from before. But I don't think there's anyone we know of from Dumban's past who's presumed dead and despite no body being found, who could have been captured by the Mechon long enough ago to become one of their first Hom-Mechon hybrids. Especially no one so adept at fighting with claws. Oh well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see how it all unfolds. Rage, Darkness of the Heart was playing for the entirety of this cutscene, starting off at the Call for Action segment as we have now tipped from sorrow to rage, and a seed of vengeance has been planted in Shulk and the others. The scene fades to black. Fiora's death cutscene is one the community feels very fondly for, and it's clear why. These manually animated cutscenes are very well done, with a lot of care put into the cinematography. It also helps that it has the best example of voice acting in the game, as can be clearly proven by the fact not a single YouTuber has ever used another example to showcase the voice actor's skills.
Shulk's reaction to Fiora's death is just...
I'll kill you!
It still gives me goosebumps.
In particular, I've got to shout out Adam Howden as Shulk. This guy gives his absolute heart into this performance, and one of the highlights of voice acting in video games is this.
I'll kill you!
Chills, dude. Literally every time.
But there's no way you can say that the voice acting in this game is bad.
I'll kill you!
It's very easy to be swept up in the presentation of these scenes, the cinematography, acting and musical score, and thus forget completely about the writing that led to this point. The rest of these two chapters haven't been particularly memorable, so when anyone thinks back to the early chapters, this will stand out in their mind, and they will just remember how great this moment was. With enough of these moments, the stretches of mediocrity may simply be forgotten in time. We did it, Ryan. We saved Colony 9. Oh look, the bootleg Eiffel Tower is fixed. Can't have their #1 tourist attraction stay damaged now, can we? An unknown amount of time has passed. Shulk's back on his bench at the usual spot, pondering Fiora for once. He's thinking back to one of their only major cutscenes so far, wondering how he could have missed those death flags.
I hope every day can be like this, always.
But seriously, we didn't need this flashback. We didn't even need Shulk randomly uttering her name to himself. No one would question what's going through his mind right now. Ryan shows up to talk, and we see that while he's able to go speak with Shulk, he can't bring himself to be there for Dunban. Guess he's lacking a bit in emotional maturity and simply latches on to Shulk for some reason. Shulk already visited Dunban and lets Ryan know that it was Dunban that ended up consoling him. The two admire how strong he can be as Shulk zooms out to flashback how he was consoled by Dunban over the loss of Fiora, rather than the other way around. We see the scene play out. Dunban decided after the Battle of Sword Valley not to shed tears for his comrades as they died protecting those they loved. Thus, instead of crying that his sister is dead, he'll simply be happy that Shulk is alive. That's certainly an interesting perspective I can see someone adopting to cope with the loss of many brothers in arms, but it still feels strange to me that he takes the loss of his sister and makes it about Shulk. He implores Shulk to treasure the life Fiora gave him. But Shulk is too consumed by vengeance to let it go, so he suggests to Ryan that the two of them should go on a revenge-fueled Mechon genocide. In fact, it's his life purpose to destroy them all now. Ryan says this seems a bit out of character for Shulk and that he expected to be the one to suggest it. I can't really see Ryan suggest that myself, but then again we still know nothing about him. He just doesn't seem to be the kind of character to have, I don't know, motives, goals, desires. Shulk responds that there's a voice in his head telling him to kill every last one of them, which Ryan simply laughs off as being his own voice in Shulk's head. It's not a bad way to rationalize why Shulk would go after them despite his usual demeanor, and shows he's conflicted. And since Ryan has been shown as dumb enough that I can believe he would ignore those red flags about Shulk's mental health, and also confident enough to think he can protect Shulk from any danger, it makes sense he would support this foolish quest for revenge. They leave immediately, seemingly without even saying goodbye. Now, the real question is why Dunban is so eager to join them on their quest after what he said about how Shulk should value his life. I suppose he only said he wouldn't cry for Fiora, but nothing about not going on a suicidal quest for genocide and vengeance. I do really like this last scene of the chapter though, and so far Dunban is by far the most fleshed out and complex character we got. Now what's with Dixon skulking about with that cheeky smile though? With chapter 2 complete, we have the full opening to the game. These two chapters do a great job setting up the conflict, the story, and the world. At least in large sweeping terms. We don't really know any details about anything yet, but we understand the broad strokes. The rules of the world are so far really consistent and help us follow the events of the story, and on top of that, all the events that have unfolded so far have played into each other really well. However, that praise is for what they accomplish and not how they get there. While the dialogue isn't all bad, there are too many repetitions and painful deliveries of exposition that could have been cut or improved. While everyone has different tolerances and preferences for which aspects of writing are important, these conversations can severely hamper a player's ability to get invested in the characters, as their conversations focus more on clearly stating the important information than it does fleshing out the personalities of our cast. It's not good when a character talks and I only hear the writer telling me about whatever they think I need to know. Most lines do at least serve some purpose, but it's only ever telling us important plot details so the event of the story can happen. Serving many purposes with few words is a great talent and one which is usually not on display here. This is pretty apparent when Fiora delivers Shulky's sandwich. The earlier draft must have said, and then they make small talk that will make the players like Fiora, and they just improvised from there. She talks about the breeze and how much she enjoys being alive, and how much she enjoys that the colony is currently not being raided by Mechon, and how she wants all of those things to keep being that way because she enjoys those things being that way. There, character building. As you likely gathered from my commentary, I don't find Fiora's death impactful at all. While the cutscene itself is great in a vacuum, it's ruined by the poor setup. Fiora's had very minimal screen time up until now, and it's only really served to show us how important she is to the other characters, but she hasn't been given enough good moments for me to grow attached to her. Sorry, I take that back. She's barely even important to the others. Shulk barely showed any affection for her before her death, because they played him as oblivious to her crush on him and too occupied with pondering the Monado than paying attention to her.
For the last time, I'm dating a motorcycle.
But why date a motorcycle when you can have me?
Tell her, Jack.
Girls are smelly!
He's right, they are.
Ryan and Fiora are shown not to be on good terms for unexplored reasons that I can at this point only chalk up to Fiora being upset that sometimes Shulk is slightly harmed after he drags Ryan along to do some salvaging, or tags along with Ryan for some military punishment. And finally, there's Dumban, who clearly cares for her, but also seems like he cares about Shulk just slightly more based on the flashback of his return to the colony and how he ends up consoling Shulk about his own sister's death. Additionally, her second major cutscene in the game was her waving a huge death flag around, which could immediately take anyone who spots it out of the moment. Fortunately, her death serves far more than just an emotional moment, as all the events up to this point has been carefully crafted to lead to her death, and her death leads to Shulk and Ryan going on a journey that leads into the rest of the game. Something as simple as Ryan not being dumb enough to leave the transport cases back at the colony could have been enough to save her life. And while I'm bothered by multiple repetitions of every piece of information in this chain of events, I'll concede it could help some people follow along the whole chain of events even if they missed a few bits. So even if you were just laughing at the Defense Force Colonel shouting about his soldiers crashing the mobile artillery into the house, you'll get 2 or 3 reminders.
The ether fuel proceeded to leak out, and now the cylinder is empty. The auxiliary cylinders have all been used up.
So you have to go and collect the ether cylinders. That's the one. They're used to power the mobile artillery.
Right, Fiora!
They're still the mobile artillery.
Right! If we recharge it with those ether cylinders we collected, we can blast our way in!
But I really hope this needless level of condescending repetition doesn't become a habit. It punishes players for paying attention by wasting their time with repetition, and it robs the game of some replay value as there aren't many details you could have missed in your first playthrough. So, the story is so far carried by the high concept of Bionis vs Mechonis alongside the mystery of the Monado. The most interesting character is left behind while Shulk is single-handedly pushing the story forward after an inner conflict that lasted mere moments and was only stated rather than shown in any kind of engaging manner. By skipping the immediate aftermath of Metal Face's retreat, they missed an opportunity for a huge emotional payoff, seeing how Shulk and the other dealt with the loss. Then, by using a flashback to show Shulk's conversation with Dumban, we didn't get to see if it was hard for Shulk to work up the courage, how he started the conversation, or how it ended. We get a brief clip of the most important line, and that's it. When showing that Shulk is mourning Fiora, we only see the park scene with the death flag. They could have shown a new memory that we hadn't seen before, telling us more of their relationship and making a new attempt to make us care for her even though she's already dead, instead of just showing a rerun. So much wasted potential for heavy emotional moments. That said, now that we are past the inciting incident and the grand adventure begins, it's hard not to be engaged in how the story will unfold from here. But just the plot. The characters are incredibly lacking, but I at least want to know more about why the Mechon do what they do, what the deal is with the Monado, and what will happen to Shulk and Ryan on their journey. As far as the world building is concerned, it's another mixed bag. The high concept is really strong and unique, which hints at something deeper than the black and white conflict the main characters are faced with. At the same time, there are so many missed opportunities where it seems like something's missing. There's a creation myth about the Bionis and Mechonis, a tale that some people apparently tell, but there's no person or organization that appears as the source of it. The Monado is supposedly the blade once wielded by the world god itself, yet there's no reverence for it, and it's just held unsecured in a doorless lab where any hobo could walk in and pick it up. Even though home settlements are called colonies, there still isn't any direct implication there was a greater civilization that actually founded them. They believe that Dumban exterminated every single last Mechon, yet he isn't given any special reverence either, just like the Monado. They believe that Dumban exterminated every single last Mechon, and yet Shulk talks about how good it would be if he could get anyone other than Dumban to wield the explicitly anti-Mechon weapon. They believe that Dumban exterminated every single last Mechon, and yet a third of the colony is dedicated exclusively to the military-industrial complex. A lot of puzzle pieces that don't quite fit together, with possible explanations that could be invented, but that would contradict some other pieces. Some of these threads will be elaborated on in the future, while others will be made so much worse with extra context. Instead, the focus of the world building isn't on a grand scale. It's not the lore of the world that got the writer's undivided attention, but the colony itself. Sort of. There are 45 NPCs in Colony 9, all of whom have some personality traits, some history, some relations with other characters, etc. The more quests we do, the greater the web of their relationships become. Great effort was put into making the colony feel alive and to make these characters appear to have their own lives. So what a shame that 3/4 of the quests so far being filler leads to the average bit of quest text not being worth reading. For the real quests, there still isn't that much of interest going on. Ultimately, they don't tell us anything about the world, just about the daily lives of those who live here. Beyond the writing itself, the quests end up being a long list of chores to do, since you can just follow the waypoint leading you to whatever must be picked up, spoken to, or killed. But what if I told you that it wasn't always like this? That once upon a time, every single piece of quality of life in this game was absent, and it made the game a completely different experience. You could track one quest, and only got a marker on the map, no dotted line to follow. If you ever wanted to see what was left for you to do, you would need to go into your slow-loading quest log and check objectives one by one. Don't want to do that? Better take notes or exercise your memory. Suddenly, even the generic monster quests require you to read the dialogue, because it's much faster to just pay attention when you're first told than to have to flip through the quest log for a reminder. Suddenly, the player becomes conditioned to pay attention to everything instead of skipping through it. Systems such as trading, which barely appears to be relevant, suddenly have a purpose. If you don't know where to get a particular monster drop or collectible, it may be easier to just find who's willing to trade it with you. And with this use case, even overtrade begins to make sense, as collectibles tend to be worth a whole lot more than monster drops. So when you trade a 3000 gold glass flower for a 150 gold slugtooth, it can be nice to at least get something extra for your effort. And the few times you don't, you know there might be something really valuable behind that overtrade. Even all the hundreds of pointless monster drops used to have a purpose, as you must sell them to make room in your inventory for, well, more pointless monster drops. I guess a veteran player might be able to remember what major drops are used for important quests and could thus hold on to only those, but beyond that the system doesn't serve much of a purpose. Though at least by forcing the player's hand to selling, it led to an influx of money, while I almost never had to sell anything in Definitive Edition. While I'm still bothered by how obtuse it is to track down all the NPCs, especially when quests may be locked behind any one particular NPC, my only conclusion for this is that the game was not made with completionism in mind. Every single aspect of the original Wii version seems meticulously designed to force players to slow down, take their time, immerse themselves in the world, and explore. That way, when you suddenly spot an NPC you don't recall speaking to before, and it opens up an entirely new questline, you are rewarded. Beyond that, the combat was also very deliberately designed around the Wiimote and the nunchuck. I won't defend the controller itself, as having to use the D-pad to control the camera is incredibly awkward, but in combat there is one clear advantage to the Wiimote. Select arts with the D-pad, use arts with A. Same as with Joy-Cons, except both D-pad and A button are operated with the same thumb. This means your other thumb is free to move for positionals. Considering how important it is to get your positionals down in order to do well in this game, this is a pretty big deal. It's not exactly a huge problem to adopt a claw grip or stop moving to select your arts on the Switch, but it's very clear the combat was not designed for that controller, which is why the system was completely overhauled for Xenoblade 2 and 3. Ultimately, the quality of life added in Definitive Edition sanded down all the rough parts of the original, or most of them at least. The game has never been easier to play, but the experience is so fundamentally different that it's hard for me to say that Definitive Edition truly is the definitive way to experience the game. The original is a game that requires you to spend a lot of time learning and understanding the world in order to complete enough quests to earn the experience to progress the main story. Definitive Edition is a game where you need to complete a checklist of trivial tasks that the game walks you through before you're allowed to continue. Or, realistically, the internet curses both versions, as modern players will look up every quest and NPC online, thus turning even the original into the same chore as DE has become. For my final words on these chapters, I want to praise how much information you can glean from just this beginning. While I've mentioned how many loose ends don't seem to match the world we see, and some of the speculation I've done include incorrect conclusions, I'd say all of it are reasonable thoughts anyone could come to if they simply pay attention to all the details. While some of this theorizing and some loose ends ultimately will lead nowhere, that's more a problem with lacking payoff later in the game rather than anything that's wrong with these chapters. With some tweaks and rewrites, it's surprising how many pieces fall into place, but that will have to come when we have the full picture. So even if the dialogue and characters are utterly lacking so far, the world at large invites speculation and holds a lot of promise for future chapters.